Hello friends, welcome to Legacy of Thrones. Imagine standing on a cliff in West Wales at dusk. The wind is coming off the Atlantic, carrying something ancient in it, something that has no name in any modern language. Below you, the sea is a deep greenish black, the kind of color you only see at the edge of the world. The land behind you is impossibly green, folded into valleys and ridges that feel like they were shaped by hands too old to belong to any civilization you've ever read about in a history book. And if you turn around and look at the faces of the people who live here, you notice something that takes a moment to settle into your mind. They don't look quite like the English. They don't look like the Scots. They don't look like the French or the Germans or the Italians or any of the other peoples who are supposed to share the same broad family of European ancestry. There is something in their faces that feels older, something in their eyes that doesn't quite fit any category, something in the bone structure, the coloring, the particular way that certain features cluster together in certain valleys and certain towns that makes geneticists stop and stare at their data for a very long time before they say anything at all. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know. Where are you right now and what time is it? That feeling you get looking at the Welsh, that quiet sense of encountering something genuinely ancient and unplaceable. It isn't poetic imagination. It isn't romantic Celtic nationalism speaking. It is according to the evidence that has been quietly accumulating in genetics laboratories and archaeological sites and linguistic departments across Europe for the past 3 decades, pointing towards something real. Something that the mainstream history books haven't fully caught up with yet. Something that when you follow it all the way to its logical conclusion doesn't just change how you think about Wales. It changes how you think about where civilization itself began on this island. About who was really here first, about what happened in those lost millennia between the end of the last ice age and the first written records, and about whether the story we've been told about European prehistory is as complete as we've been led to believe. This is not a simple story. It is not the story that gets told in school. It is not the story that fits neatly into the timeline that historians prefer, where everything is tidy and sequential and well-sourced and safely settled. This is the story that lives at the edges of the academic world, where geneticists and archaeologists and linguists keep finding things that don't fit their models, and where the data keeps pointing in directions that nobody fully expected. It is a story about blood and bone and language and memory, about a people who survived something that should have killed them, about an island that was populated and depopulated and repopulated in ways that we are only beginning to understand, and about why, if you do a genetic ancestry test today and you come back with a very high percentage of what the labs call ancient British ancestry, you might actually be carrying in your body the genetic signature of people who were living on this island before farming existed, before bronze existed, before anyone had thought to call this place Britain at all. The Welsh call themselves the Cymry. It means roughly the compatriots, the people of the same land. But the land they are compatriots of is far older than any kingdom, any tribe, any culture that has ever borne that name. The land itself is a record, and if you know how to read it, if you know what the stones and the soil and the place names and the genetics are actually saying, then what emerges is a portrait of a people who have been sitting at the western edge of Europe for so long that the concept of the western edge of Europe didn't exist when their ancestors first arrived. We need to go back much further back than you might expect. Further back than the Romans, who called this place Britannia and never really managed to conquer the part of it that would become Wales. Further back than the Celts who swept across Europe in the first millennium before the Common Era and whose languages survive today in Welsh and Irish and Scottish Gaelic and Breton and Cornish. Further back than the Beaker people who arrived on this island around 4,500 years ago, with their distinctive pottery and their bronze working and their habit of burying their dead in a very particular way. Further back than the builders of Stonehenge, who were themselves already inheriting a landscape that had been shaped by human hands for thousands of years before them. We need to go back to the end of the Ice Age, to a time when Britain was not an island at all, to a time when the land that would become Wales was the far western edge of a vast cold steppe, and the people who lived there were among the most isolated and enduring human populations in all of the post-glacial world. About 15,000 years ago, the great ice sheets that had covered northern Britain for tens of thousands of years began to retreat. They did not retreat smoothly or quickly. They retreated in pulses, advancing and withdrawing over centuries and millennia, and the landscape they left behind was not immediately hospitable. It was raw and barren and brutally cold, scraped clean of soil in many places, scattered with debris and meltwater, and the bones of animals that had not survived. But life followed the ice. Plants first, then animals, then people. Small groups of hunter-gatherers moving north and west along the edges of the retreating glaciers, following the herds of reindeer and wild horse and aurochses that were moving into newly available land. And among the first of these people to reach what we now call Britain, some went further west than others. Some went all the way to the edge of the land, to the place where the cliffs drop into the Atlantic, and there is no further west to go, and some of them stayed. This is where the story of the Welsh people, in the deepest possible sense, actually begins. Not with the Celts, not with Arthur or Merlin or any of the other figures who cluster around the Welsh historical imagination. With small groups of Ice Age survivors who made it to the western margins of a thawing continent and found in the hills and valleys of what is now Wales a place that suited them. A place with rivers full of fish and forests filling with game and stone that could be worked into tools and flint that could be knapped into blades. A place where the climate moderated by the Atlantic was milder than the interior of the continent. A place that felt after the brutal cold of the glacial maximum, like somewhere a person might actually want to stay. Now, here is where it gets genuinely strange. When geneticists began doing large-scale ancient DNA studies of British prehistory, starting in earnest in the 2010s and accelerating through the early 2020s, they found something that nobody had fully anticipated. They found that the people who came to Britain at the end of the Ice Age, the people who were here before the Neolithic farmers, arrived around 6,000 years ago, the people whose genetic signature we call Western Hunter-Gatherers, or WHG, they contributed an unusually large proportion of the ancestry of modern Welsh people. Not a trace, not a small percentage that you might chalk up to a historical accident. A substantial, measurable, remarkable proportion that distinguishes the Welsh from almost every other population in Europe that has been sampled and tested. To understand why this is so extraordinary, you need to understand what happened to Western hunter-gatherers almost everywhere else in Europe. The short version is, they were replaced. When farming arrived in Europe from Anatolia, the region we now call Turkey, around 9 to 10,000 years ago, it spread west and north with astonishing speed. The Anatolian farmers who carried this agricultural revolution were not just spreading a technology, they were spreading themselves. They moved into Europe in large numbers, and wherever they went, the indigenous hunter-gatherers were displaced, not always violently, not always quickly. But the end result was the same. Almost everywhere you look in the ancient DNA record, the hunter-gatherers shrank. Their genetic contribution to later populations dropped toward a residual level. The farmers took over the landscape, reproduced in greater numbers because farming supported higher population density, and within a few thousand years, the genetic signature of the original European hunter-gatherers had been diluted to a small fraction of the ancestry of most European populations, except in some places on the Atlantic fringe, except most dramatically and most consistently in Wales. When researchers published major studies of ancient British DNA, they found that the genetic ancestry of modern Welsh people carries a higher proportion of the pre-Neolithic, pre-farming hunter-gatherer ancestry than almost any other population in Europe that has been systematically studied. Some studies have put the WHG component of Welsh ancestry higher than that of almost any continental European population. This is not a small or easily dismissed finding. This is the genetic record telling us that the people who arrived in what is now Wales after the Ice Age, those original colonizers of the Atlantic fringe, never fully disappeared. Their descendants persisted through all the waves of subsequent migration, through the Neolithic farmers and the Bronze Age Beaker people, and the Celtic-speaking Iron Age communities, and the Romans, and the Saxons. Through all of that, the ancient bloodline held on. Diluted, yes. Changed, yes. Mixed with all those incoming peoples, yes, but still present, still measurable, still enough to make Wales genetically distinct from England in ways that can be detected in a laboratory, and distinct in a very specific direction. Older. And this raises an immediate question, one that the data alone cannot fully answer. Why? Why did this ancient ancestry persist in Wales in proportions that it didn't persist almost anywhere else in Europe? Why did the wave of replacement that swept across the continent leave Wales relatively more intact than other regions? The answer, when you start pulling at it, reveals a whole series of interlocking stories about geography and climate and language and political history, and the particular stubbornness of people who live on the edge of the world. And some of those stories are going to take us to places that the conventional history of the British Isles doesn't usually go. Start with geography. Wales is not an easy place to conquer. It never has been. The Romans knew this. The Romans, who had successfully conquered almost every other part of what is now England, who had pushed all the way to the Scottish Highlands in their more ambitious moments, never fully subjugated Wales. They built forts along its borders. They controlled the lands and the coasts. They mined its silver and its gold. But the interior, the mountains of Snowdonia, the rugged heartland of the Cambrian Mountains, the deep valleys of the south, these remained places where Roman control was always partial, always contested, always requiring more military effort than the Romans were ultimately willing to sustain. And if the Romans couldn't fully do it, the various waves of Anglo-Saxon migration that swept into post-Roman Britain certainly couldn't either. The Anglo-Saxons, who gave England its name and its dominant language, largely stayed out of Wales, not because they weren't interested, but because the land itself resisted them. Mountains and rivers and thick forests and people who had been defending this terrain for longer than any written record can trace. What this meant in genetic terms was that Wales became something of a refuge, a place where ancient populations could persist because the land made it difficult for outside populations to move in sufficient numbers to replace them. This is a pattern you see repeatedly in European prehistory and history. Isolated, difficult terrain preserves older genetic signatures. The Basque Country in northern Spain, another mountain refuge on the Atlantic fringe, has a similarly ancient genetic signature and famously preserves the most ancient surviving language in Europe, one with no known relatives and no clear connection to any other language family on Earth. The Scottish Highlands, Sardinia, certain valleys in the Alps. The correlation between geographical difficulty and genetic antiquity is one of the most robust patterns in European population genetics. But geography alone doesn't fully explain what happened in Wales, because the Welsh landscape, while challenging, is not as extreme as the Scottish Highlands. And yet the Welsh have retained more of their ancient ancestry than the Scots have. Something else was happening in Wales, something that has to do with language. The Welsh language is extraordinary. Linguists who specialize in ancient languages have described it in various ways as a living fossil. Not because it is primitive or simple. It is anything but, with a grammatical complexity that gives English speakers nightmares, but because it preserves features of ancient Celtic speech that have been worn away or lost in other Celtic languages. Welsh has undergone less radical change than Irish, less simplification than Cornish, less external influence than Scottish Gaelic. And the Welsh language, unlike any of those other Celtic languages, never came close to dying out in its heartland. In certain parts of Wales, in Gwyn D in the northwest, and in parts of the southwest, Welsh remained the language of daily life, of the home, of the chapel, of the community through all the centuries of English political dominance. It was never fully replaced, It came under enormous pressure. It was suppressed in schools. It was mocked and dismissed and treated as the dialect of a backward people. But it survived. And its survival is connected in ways that are not always obvious to the genetic story we've been exploring. Here is why language is more than communication. Language is identity. When a community maintains a distinct language, it tends to maintain other forms of distinctiveness as well. It tends to marry within itself at higher rates. It tends to preserve cultural practices and social structures that reinforce group cohesion. It tends to resist assimilation in ways that linguistically assimilated communities do not. This is not a universal rule, and it is not absolute. But the correlation between linguistic persistence and genetic distinctiveness is strong enough to show up consistently in population genetic studies. Communities that maintain distinct languages tend to show more genetic continuity with their ancestors than communities that shift to dominant languages. And Wales maintained its language longer and more stubbornly than almost any other minority language community in Western Europe. So the Welsh language and the Welsh genetic distinctiveness are not separate stories. They are two expressions of the same underlying reality. A people at the western edge of Europe who held on, who persisted, who kept something alive through wave after wave of external pressure that erased similar things everywhere else. But we are still only at the surface of this story. Because the genetic data doesn't just tell us that the Welsh retained more ancient ancestry. It raises a deeper question about what that ancient ancestry actually was, where it came from, what kind of people those original Atlantic fringe colonizers were, and whether they brought with them things that have not yet been fully recognized or understood. The Western hunter-gatherers who colonized the Atlantic margins of Europe after the Ice Age were not a simple or homogeneous group. They were the remnants of populations that had survived the last glacial maximum in what geneticists call refugia, pockets of relatively hospitable territory in southern Europe, where humans could persist while the ice covered the north. The most important of these refugia for the ancestry of the Welsh were probably in the Iberian Peninsula, what is now Spain and Portugal. And this Iberian connection, which shows up in ancient DNA studies and in older genetic studies that looked at modern populations, is the thread that, if you pull on it hard enough, leads to one of the most controversial and fascinating debates in the study of ancient British history. For much of the 20th century, there was a theory that the Celtic languages of Britain and Ireland, Welsh and Irish and Scottish Gaelic and Cornish and Breton, came to these islands with a wave of migration from Central Europe from the Hallstatt and Leighton cultures that archaeologists associate with Celtic-speaking peoples in the archaeological record. This Central European origin theory was more or less the consensus. It seemed to fit with the archaeological evidence of similar art styles and metal working techniques and burial practices appearing across a wide arc of Western Europe in the first millennium before the Common Era. And then the DNA came in and complicated everything, because the DNA studies showed that while there was certainly migration from Central Europe during the Bronze and Iron Ages, the genetic contribution of those Central European migrants to the populations of Wales and Ireland was relatively modest. The dominant ancient ancestry of the Welsh and Irish is not Central European. It goes further back than the Hallstatt culture. It goes back to those Atlantic fringe populations, the WHG descendants who had been living on the edges of the ocean for thousands of years before the Central European Celts appeared on the scene. This has led to a genuinely radical rethinking of where the Celtic languages came from. A growing number of linguists and geneticists now argue that Celtic languages did not arrive in Britain from Central Europe during the Iron Age. They argue that Celtic languages, or at least the ancestor of Celtic languages, came to Britain and Ireland much earlier, possibly carried by those Atlantic coast populations who were spreading along the ocean margins of Europe in the Neolithic or even earlier. The so-called Atlantic Celtic hypothesis suggests that the Celtic language family originated not in the Central European heartland, but along the Atlantic coast in or near Iberia, and spread northward along the coast to Brittany and Britain and Ireland, carried by people who were related to each other, by both culture and blood. If this is correct, and the evidence is growing stronger by the year, then the Welsh language is not simply an Iron Age import to Britain. It is something much older. It is the linguistic expression of a relationship between the people of the Atlantic fringe that goes back many thousands of years to a time before the Bronze Age, possibly to a time before farming reached these shores at all. It means that when a Welsh speaker and an Irish speaker sit down and compare their languages and find deep structural similarities that go far beyond what you would expect from 1,000 years of occasional contact, they are detecting echoes of a shared ancestry that is genuinely ancient, genuinely prehistoric in the deepest sense. And it means that the genetic distinctiveness of the Welsh is not just a quirk of geography. It is a remnant, a living remnant of the oldest layer of European population on the Atlantic fringe. A population that spoke ancestral Celtic languages that had a distinctive appearance determined by their WHG ancestry that developed the traditions and the cosmologies and the social structures that would eventually be called Celtic, not because Celts invaded from Central Europe, but because the people of the Atlantic fringe were always Celtic, or became Celtic so early that the distinction between always and early enough barely matters. Now, we need to go somewhere that the standard histories of Britain rarely go. We need to talk about Doggerland. Between roughly 10,000 and 6,000 years ago, there was a large landmass connecting Britain to continental Europe. It occupied what is now the bed of the North Sea and parts of the English Channel. Geologists and archaeologists call it Doggerland, after the Dogger Bank fishing ground, where trawlers have been pulling up mammoth teeth and human artifacts for over a century. Doggerland was not a barren wasteland. It was a rich and productive landscape, with rivers and forests and wetlands full of game and fish and edible plants. It was probably one of the most attractive places in northwestern Europe for hunter-gatherers to live, and people did live there in substantial numbers for thousands of years. Then the ice continued to melt. Sea levels continued to rise, and Doggerland was drowned gradually at first. Then with increasing speed, as the waters of the Atlantic found ways through the chalk ridge that had been keeping them back, and poured into the North Sea basin. By about 6,500 years ago, Britain was an island. The land bridge was gone. Doggerland was under the sea, and the people who had been living on Doggerland, those who survived the flooding, those who saw the waters rising over the course of generations and moved to higher ground, many of them moved west, to Wales, to Ireland, to the coastal margins where the land had not yet drowned. This is not a story that gets much airtime in popular histories of Britain. Doggerland is known to specialists, to geologists and maritime archaeologists and physical geographers, but its implications for the population history of the British Isles are enormous. Because if substantial numbers of Doggerland refugees moved to the western margins of Britain in the period between roughly 8 and 6,000 years ago, they would have added another layer to the Atlantic fringe population, reinforcing the WHG genetic signature of the people already living in Wales and Western Britain, and possibly bringing with them cultural practices and linguistic forms that added to the developing distinctiveness of Atlantic fringe culture. We cannot yet directly test this with ancient DNA, because the ancient DNA from Doggerland people is mostly sitting at the bottom of the North Sea, but the circumstantial evidence is compelling. There are archaeological sites in Wales that show sudden increases in population and cultural activity in the Mesolithic period, roughly the period when Doggerland was flooding. There are artifacts turning up at sites in Wales that have close parallels with Mesolithic sites in what is now the Netherlands and Denmark. And there are genetic signals in the modern Welsh population that some researchers interpret as evidence of ancestry from a population that had been living in the North Sea basin before the flooding. The sea, in other words, did not just take something away from the story of the Welsh. In a strange way, it gave something. The flooding of Doggerland pushed people to the edges, to the refuges, to the western margins where the land held firm, and those people became part of what we now call the Welsh. But let's go even deeper, because there is another layer to this story that most people have never heard. a layer that connects Wales not just to the rest of Europe, but in a way that will seem almost impossible until you look at the evidence, to the story of prehistoric North America. In 1996, near Kennewick in Washington state, two young men stumbled upon a human skull while watching a hydroplane race on the Columbia River. The skull turned out to belong to one of the most complete ancient human skeletons ever found in North America. A man who had lived approximately 9,000 years ago during the early Holocene, the same broad period when Doggerland was flooding and the Atlantic fringe of Europe was being repopulated by post-glacial hunter-gatherers. The skeleton was eventually named Kennewick Man, or in the Umatilla language, the Ancient One. What happened next was one of the most controversial episodes in the history of American archaeology, because when physical anthropologists began examining the skull of Kennewick Man, they made an observation that set off a decade and a half of legal battles, political controversy, and academic dispute. The skull, they said, did not look like the skulls of modern Native American populations. It looked in certain respects more like the skulls of people from the Pacific Rim, from certain populations in Asia, or even some researchers dared to suggest like the skulls of people from certain ancient populations in Europe. Now, before we go any further, let us be clear about what this observation did not mean. It did not mean that Kennewick Man was European. It did not mean that white people were in America before Native Americans. That interpretation, which was pushed enthusiastically by certain groups with ideological axes to grind, is not supported by the evidence. What the physical anthropology and eventually the DNA of Kennewick Man actually showed is something far more interesting and far more complex than any of those simple narratives. The DNA of Kennewick Man showed that he was most closely related to modern Native American populations. He was unambiguously a Native American descended from the populations that crossed into the Americas from northeastern Asia via Beringia, the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska somewhere around 15 to 20,000 years ago. But his skull shape was unusual, and when researchers began trying to explain why it was unusual, they stumbled into a debate about the early prehistory of the Americas that is still unresolved and still generating some of the most exciting and contentious research in the field. The issue is this: the very first people to enter the Americas, the founding population that came across Beringia, may have been more diverse, more varied in their origins and their biology, than the relatively simple narrative of a single founding migration from northeastern Asia would suggest. There is growing evidence from multiple independent lines of research that the first Americans were not all the same, that they came from different source populations, that some of them may have taken different routes, and that the genetic and morphological diversity of ancient Native Americans is greater than the diversity of modern Native Americans, suggesting that some of the earliest lineages were subsequently reduced or replaced by later incoming populations, just as the Western hunter-gatherers of Europe were reduced and replaced by Neolithic farmers. Some researchers have proposed that one of the founding populations of the Americas, possibly one that arrived via a coastal route rather than through the interior of the continent, may have had genetic connections to populations that were also ancestral to certain groups in coastal East Asia, and perhaps through an even more ancient shared ancestry to populations in the Atlantic fringe of Europe. This is not a claim that Europeans settled America in prehistory. It is a claim about very deep shared ancestry that predates the divergence of Asian and European populations. Ancestry that goes back to the early dispersals of modern humans out of Africa and across the world. But the connection to Wales, when you trace it carefully, is more specific and more surprising than just a vague gesture toward deep shared ancestry. It involves a particular pattern in the genetics of certain Welsh populations and certain ancient Native American populations that some researchers have noticed and that others have furiously disputed. A pattern that shows up in a branch of human mitochondrial DNA, the DNA that is inherited only from mothers, called haplogroup X. Unlike most of the major mitochondrial lineages found in Native Americans, which have clear and well-documented Asian origins, haplogroup X has a distribution that is genuinely strange. It appears in Native Americans, primarily in populations in the eastern part of North America, the Ojibwe, the Sioux, certain groups in the Great Lakes region, and it appears in populations in the Near East and in certain European populations. And it appears at frequencies that are slightly higher than you would expect by chance in certain populations on the Atlantic fringe of Europe, including in Wales. The conventional explanation for this is that haplogroup X entered the Americas through Bingia, along with other founding lineages. That its presence in Europe and the Near East simply reflects the fact, then, that haplogroup X evolved somewhere in Eurasia before the peopling of the Americas and dispersed in multiple directions from there, and that the apparently anomalous distribution is actually not anomalous at all, once you account for the deep age of the lineage and the multiple dispersal events of early modern humans. This is probably the correct explanation. The science of ancient DNA has become sophisticated enough that we can now test some of these claims directly, and the results have generally supported the Bingia origin of all Native American founding lineages, including haplogroup X. But here is what makes the haplogroup X story interesting, even if the conventional explanation is correct. The deep ancestry that connects certain Welsh mitochondrial lineages to certain Native American lineages is real. It is not an artifact or a mistake. It reflects the fact that the people who eventually became the Welsh and the people who eventually became the Ojibwe and the Sioux share, in a very deep and ancient sense, a common ancestral population, a population that lived somewhere in Eurasia tens of thousands of years ago, and spread in different directions, with some descendants eventually making it to the Atlantic fringe of Europe, and others eventually making it across Bingia into the Americas. This is not the story of Celts in America or Welsh explorers reaching the New World or any of the other romantic fictions that have clustered around the genetic data. It is something simultaneously more modest and more profound. It is the story of a shared deep humanity of lineages that diverged and diverged and diverged over tens of thousands of years, and yet left in the mitochondrial DNA of a Welsh grandmother and an Ojibwe elder, a faint echo of the same ancient woman who was their common ancestor before the world split. Now, we need to talk about something that has been debated, disputed, romanticized, dismissed, and periodically resurrected in the study of early Atlantic history. We need to talk about the sea routes, because if the genetic data is telling us that the populations of the Atlantic fringe had deep and ancient connections to each other, connections that predated the Celtic language spread and possibly predated the Neolithic entirely, then the question of how those connections were maintained becomes critically important, and the answer almost certainly is boats. The people of the Atlantic fringe were seafarers. This is not a hypothesis, it is a documented fact. We know that people were making sea crossings in the North Atlantic region, at least by the Mesolithic, because the archaeological record shows the colonization of offshore islands that could not have been reached any other way. The island of Ororon in the Inner Heads was occupied by Neolithic hunter-gatherers thousands of years ago. Ireland was colonized shortly after the last ice age by people who must have crossed the water that separated it from Britain. The very fact of human presence in Britain after the ice age requires sea crossings during certain periods. Because the land bridge through Doggerland was not always available, and the timing of various colonization events does not always line up with the availability of dryland routes. By the Neolithic and Bronze Age, the evidence for Atlantic seafaring becomes overwhelming. The pottery, the metalwork, the megalithic monuments, the genetic data all tell the same story. The people of the Atlantic fringe, from Iberia to Brittany to Cornwall to Wales to Ireland to Scotland, were in contact with each other. They were trading, they were moving, they were intermarrying, they were sharing ideas and technologies and possibly languages. And they were doing all of this across open water in boats that we cannot find because the boats were made of wood and hide and have not survived, but whose existence the evidence forces us to infer. The megalithic monuments of Atlantic Europe are one of the most striking expressions of this interconnected Atlantic world. The great stone tombs and standing circles and alignment sites that run from Portugal to Scandinavia, from the western coast of France to the Orkney Islands, share architectural features and cultural practices that cannot be explained by independent invention. They are too similar, too consistent. The builders knew about each other, and the DNA of the people buried in these monuments shows that they were related to each other, that they shared the Doggerland ancestry of the Atlantic fringe, that they were not separate, isolated communities, but members of a network that stretched the length of the Atlantic coast. Wales has more megalithic monuments per square mile than almost any other region in the British Isles. Pentre Efan in Pembrokeshire, with its massive capstone balanced on 3 uprights as if it were made of paper. Bryn Chelyddu on Anglesey, a passage tomb that aligns with the rising sun on the summer solstice. The Preseli Hills, from which the blue stones of Stonehenge were quarried and carried somehow 380 kilometers to Salisbury Plain. The evidence that Wales was not a peripheral backwater in the Atlantic megalithic world, but one of its most active and significant centers, is everywhere you look. And here is something that the conventional histories of Stonehenge have underemphasized. The people who carried the blue stones from the Preseli Hills to Stonehenge were not just skilled engineers. They were making a statement about connection, about the relationship between the western margins of Britain and the great monument of the plain. Whatever Stonehenge was, whatever it meant and was used for, it incorporated stone from Wales. It incorporated the deep geological memory of the ancient Welsh landscape. And whoever decided that it should be built that way, that the blue stones from Preseli specifically, and not some other stone from somewhere closer should be used, whoever made that decision understood something about the relationship between Wales and the wider world of Atlantic megalithic culture that we have not yet fully deciphered. Let us talk about the Preseli Hills specifically, because they are one of the places where the deepest stories about Wales converge. The hills are low by the standards of Snowdonia, rising to about 500 meters at their highest point. They are covered in a kind of heath and rough grass that has a particular quality in the morning light, a silvery green that looks almost like something out of a fantasy novel, until you realize that this is simply what ancient landscape looks like when it has not been significantly disturbed for several thousand years. The outcrops of dolerite and rhyolite and spotted duarite that break through the heath have a distinctly otherworldly quality, great jagged toss that rise from the mand like broken teeth. These hills have been sacred to the people who lived near them for at least 5,000 years, and probably much longer. They contain a remarkable concentration of prehistoric sites, from Neolithic tombs to Bronze Age cairns to Iron Age hill forts, all layered on top of each other in a palimpsest of human meaning that goes back as far as the human presence in this part of Wales, and they are the source of the blue stones. The specific quarry sites have been identified by researchers working with the Stonehenge Riverside Project and subsequent investigations. Carn God and Rossiflelyn are the main sources. And what the archaeological work at these sites has shown is not only that stone was quarried there, but that the quarrying happened in a very specific and deliberate way, using methods that suggest a sophisticated understanding of the stone's properties and a clear intention to produce specific shapes and sizes of monument stone. Why Preseli? Why did the builders of Stonehenge, or whoever commissioned the monument, decide that the stone needed to come from this specific place more than 300 kilometers away, when there was perfectly usable stone much closer to hand? Various explanations have been proposed. Some researchers think the blue stones had a specific religious or cosmological significance connected to the Preseli Hills, perhaps because of existing sacred sites there, perhaps because the hills were associated with a particular deity or spiritual power in the belief system of the time. Others have suggested that the quarrying of stone from such a distant source was itself a demonstration of the network of connections and obligations that bound the Atlantic world together, a monument to the relationships as much as to any astronomical or religious purpose. What we can say with confidence is that the connection between Wales and Stonehenge is not incidental. It is fundamental to the monument's identity. And what that tells us is that in the period when Stonehenge was being built and elaborated roughly between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, Wales was not the periphery. Wales was not the edge. Wales was one of the centers of a world that looked outward to the Atlantic and the Ceylonese of the West, not inward to the continental heartland of Europe. This is a complete inversion of the usual way we think about British prehistory. We usually imagine civilizations spreading from east to west. From the continental heartland to the Atlantic fringe, agriculture from Anatolia, bronze from the iron from Central Europe, Celtic languages from the Hallstatt culture. In this narrative, Wales is always the last to receive, always the end point, always the place where things arrive after a long journey from somewhere else. But the Stonehenge blue stone story and the broader picture of the Atlantic megalithic world suggests a different geography of significance, a geography in which the Atlantic itself was the highway, in which the western coast was not the end of the world but the spine of a network, and in which Wales, with its deep harbour at Milford Haven and its sea routes to Ireland and Brittany and beyond, was not peripheral at all. And the genetics support this. The genetic data that shows the Welsh retaining more ancient WHG ancestry than most continental Europeans is not a story of isolation and stagnation. It is a story of a population that was connected, that participated in the Atlantic network, that received and sent people and ideas and goods along the sea routes, but that maintained its core identity, its core genetic character through all of that exchange. The Welsh were not isolated. They were persistent. There is a difference. Now we need to confront something uncomfortable, something that the nationalist historians of Wales, and there have been many of them, have sometimes used in ways that distort the evidence, and something that the scientific community has sometimes been reluctant to discuss clearly because of the ways it has been misused. The fact of Welsh genetic distinctiveness. The fact that the Welsh carry a higher proportion of ancient European ancestry than most other populations in Europe does not mean that the Welsh are superior. It does not mean that they are a pure race. It does not mean that their ancient lineage gives them special rights or special claims. It means they are old. It means their ancestors held on. It means the genetic record of this particular group of people happens to preserve better than most the memory of who was here before all the waves of migration that remade the face of Europe. That is interesting. That is scientifically significant. That is, in a deep human sense, moving. But it is not a hierarchy. It is not a reason for pride in the sense that nationalists sometimes deploy these findings. It is a reason for curiosity. The same Western hunter-gatherer ancestry that the Welsh carry in higher proportions than most Europeans is shared in smaller amounts by people across the continent, by the English, by the French, by the Germans, by the Spanish, by the Italians. All of them carry some portion of this ancient lineage. The Welsh just carry more of it, and that is not because the Welsh deserve it or earned it. It is because their ancestors happened to live in a place that was hard to invade, happened to maintain a language that helped them stay distinct, happened to be at the western edge of a process of demographic replacement that ran out of steam before it reached them fully. There is a word in Welsh, a height, that has no precise English equivalent. It is often translated as homesickness or longing. But those translations miss something. Heth is not just a longing for a place or a time. It is a longing for something that may never have existed, or that existed so long ago that it has passed beyond memory into something that feels more like a genetic ache than a personal memory. A longing for a home that the body remembers even if the mind does not. A yearning for a belonging so ancient that it has become part of the flesh rather than part of the mind. The Welsh invented this word, or rather the Welsh maintained it from some earlier form that their ancestors used. And when you understand the genetic story of the Welsh, the story of an ancient lineage that has persisted at the western edge of Europe through all the waves of history, Heth takes on a new resonance. Because if the genetic memory of 12,000 years of Welsh ancestry is sitting in the cells of modern Welsh people, then might be one of the few words in any language that tries to name what that feels like. The ache of carrying a past so deep that it exceeds the reach of any individual life. The longing for a landscape and a belonging that your ancestors knew so thoroughly, so intimately over so many generations that it became woven into the way the body recognizes itself. We are going deeper now. We are going to a place that most popular histories of Britain never visit. We are going to talk about what the people of Neolithic and Bronze Age Wales actually believed, as best we can reconstruct it, and about whether any of those ancient beliefs left traces in the Welsh cultural record that survived into the historic period. This is delicate territory. The ancient inhabitants of Wales left no written texts. Everything we know about their beliefs comes from archaeology, from the monuments they built and the objects they buried, and the way they treated their dead, from comparative mythology, from the careful comparison of Welsh medieval literary tradition with other early Celtic and Indo-European mythological material, and from analogy with the practices of historical peoples in similar ecological and cultural positions. What the archaeological record shows us first and most clearly is that the Neolithic and Bronze Age peoples of Wales had a profound and complex relationship with the dead. The megalithic tombs that dot the Welsh landscape were not simply burial places. They were, in the understanding of their builders, portals, places where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was thin, where communication between the two realms was possible, where the ancestors could be consulted and propitiated and kept close. The tomb at Bladia Dueor on Anglesey is decorated with carved spirals and zigzags and lozines that are identical in style to the passage tomb art of Ireland and Brittany. These were not decorations, they were a visual language, a symbolic vocabulary shared across the Atlantic world, expressing something about the nature of the journey into death and the structure of the other world that lay beyond it. The bodies themselves were treated in ways that suggest a belief in the continuing agency of the dead. The remains of multiple individuals intermingled in a way that suggests the community of the dead was seen as a corporate entity, a collective rather than a collection of individuals. In others, specific bones, particularly skulls, were kept separate and given special treatment, suggesting that the head was seen as the seat of some continuing spiritual power even after death. The practice of retaining and handling the bones of the dead, of passing them around, of bringing them out into the light and then returning them, speaks of a relationship with death that is utterly unlike anything in the Christian tradition that eventually replaced it. There is a thread of this ancient relationship with the dead that runs very thin and very frayed, but still traceable through the Welsh medieval literary tradition. The Mabinogion, the great collection of Welsh mythological tales that was written down in the 12th and 13th centuries, but that preserves material far older than its written form, contains passages that scholars have identified as echoes of very ancient beliefs about the other world, about the thin places where the living and the dead are close, about heroes and heroines who cross between the worlds and return changed. The figure of Aron, king of Anwyn, the Welsh otherworld, is a ruler of a realm that is explicitly located underground in the hills and mounds where the old tombs are, in the water that surrounds islands that are somehow simultaneously real and not real. The description of Andovan in the oldest Welsh poetry is not a hell or a heaven in any recognizable Christian sense. It is a place of abundance and music and feasting and the absence of death. But it is also cold and strange and deeply alien to the living, a place you visit at your peril, and from which you return altered in ways that make normal life impossible. These descriptions are not Christian. They are not borrowed from classical mythology. They have the quality of something very old, something that predates the arrival of both Christianity and the classical world in Wales, something that belongs to a stratum of belief so ancient that it was already ancient when the medieval Welsh writers were trying to make sense of it. And when you place these descriptions alongside the archaeological evidence of how the builders of the megalithic tombs understood the relationship between the living and the dead, a possible continuity emerges, faint, uncertain, impossible to prove definitively, but there the concept of a land beneath the ground or beneath the water where the dead live in feasting and music, accessible at certain times of year or through certain physical thresholds, is not unique to Wales. It appears in Irish mythology. It appears in continental Celtic mythology. It appears in fragmentary form in the beliefs of many pre-Christian European peoples. But in Wales, it appears in a particularly concentrated and elaborate form. In Wales, it is Andubian, and the persistence of Andubian in Welsh cultural memory, through the suppression of native religious practice, through the Romanization of the elites, through the conversion to Christianity, through the political domination of the English crown, suggests that this belief was held very deeply by very many people for a very long time. We cannot say with certainty that the NWM belief is 12,000 years old. That would be going far beyond what the evidence supports. But we can say that it is old, very old enough to have accumulated the particular character it has in Welsh mythology, which is different from the way similar beliefs appear in any other cultural tradition. And when you combine that cultural antiquity with the genetic antiquity of the Welsh, what you begin to see is a picture of a people who are not simply old in their blood, but old in their spirit as well. A people who have been carrying certain stories and certain ways of understanding the world for longer than any other group in Britain, and possibly longer than most groups in Europe. Now, let's talk about appearance, because the title of this exploration promised to address why the Welsh look different from other Europeans. And while we have been circling that question, we have not yet fully landed on it. Let us be precise about what the genetic and physical anthropological data actually shows. The Welsh as a population show certain physical characteristics at higher frequencies than neighboring populations. These characteristics are not universal among Welsh people. There is enormous individual variation, as there is in any human population. But statistically at the population level, certain patterns emerge. Welsh people tend to have darker hair on average than English people, though not as dark as most southern European populations. They tend to have eyes that fall into a range of colors from deep brown through hazel and green to a particular shade of blue-gray that is distinct from the bright pale blue common in Scandinavian populations. They tend to have a particular type of complexion, often described as slightly more olive or yellowed than the typical English complexion, which is interesting because it does not fit neatly into either the Northern European pale-skinned phenotype or the Southern European darker phenotype. Some researchers have described the Welsh complexion as having a quality that is reminiscent of certain populations in Iberia, which fits with the genetic evidence of deep Iberian connections in Welsh ancestry. But perhaps the most striking aspect of Welsh physical appearance, the one that people notice most often without necessarily being able to articulate it, is something about bone structure, about the shape of the face. Welsh faces tend to have certain features that are less common in English faces: a slightly lower and wider orbit, a more prominent brow ridge in some individuals, a chin that tends to sit a certain way, cheekbones that have a particular angle. These are subtle differences. They are not dramatic. They are not the kind of thing that would allow you to identify a Welsh person from a photograph with any confidence. But they are real at the population level, and they have been noted and studied by physical anthropologists for over a century. And what the genetics suggests is that these physical characteristics reflect in part the higher WHG component of Welsh ancestry. Because the Western hunter-gatherers of ancient Europe had a distinctive appearance. That we know from ancient DNA studies was different from the appearance of both the Anatolian farmers who replaced them and the Yamna steppe past pastoralists who subsequently arrived and further shaped European populations. The WHG, based on the genetic variants associated with pigmentation and facial morphology, tended toward darker hair and eyes than modern Northern Europeans, had a skin tone that was darker than you might expect, and had facial features that are described as somewhat distinct from the Grail narrow features associated with the Anatolian farmer lineage. When the Anatolian farmers arrived in Europe and mixed with WHG populations, the resulting population had intermediate characteristics. As WHG ancestry was diluted over generations, the European average shifted toward the Anatolian farmer phenotype, and then, with the arrival of the steppe past pastoralists, shifted again. But in Wales, where the WHG component was not diluted as much as in most of Europe, more of the ancient physical characteristics persisted. The darker hair, the particular eye color, the distinctive bone structure. These are not just aesthetic details. They are, in a very literal sense, the face of 12,000 years of Atlantic coast ancestry showing through into the present. This is what people are detecting when they notice that the Welsh look different. They are not detecting something imaginary or constructed. They are detecting the faint echo of a population that was already living on the edge of the Atlantic world before the great demographic transformations of the Neolithic and Bronze and Iron Ages reshaped the genetic and physical character of most of Europe. They are seeing in the faces of the people of Cardiff and Swansea and Aberystwyth and Cayenne something that has been sitting at the western edge of this island for longer than any written record can tell. Let us go to a specific place. Now, a specific site that encapsulates in a way that no amount of abstract genetic or archaeological argument can quite match the depth and the strangeness of the Welsh past. Let us go to the Red Lady of Pavland. In 1823, an Oxford geologist named William Buckland was shown a limestone cave on the Gower Peninsula in South Wales. The cave was on a cliff face above the sea, difficult to access, spectacular in its position, and already known locally as a site where unusual bones had been found. Buckland entered the cave and began to excavate, and what he found would eventually become one of the most discussed and debated archaeological discoveries in the history of British prehistory. He found human bones, specifically the bones of a single individual stained bright red with ochre, the iron-rich mineral that we have already encountered as a fundamental element of ancient ritual practice from the earliest modern human burials around the world. The bones were of an adult individual, and Buckland, working within the intellectual framework of 1823, made two assumptions that would take nearly 2 centuries to fully correct. He assumed the bones were female because a woman's bones had been found near a mammoth skull, and because the red ochre staining and the associated ornaments, including shell beads and ivory rods, seemed to him to indicate a female. And he assumed the bones were relatively recent because his biblical worldview did not allow for the existence of humans before the flood described in Genesis, and he therefore interpreted the remains as those of a Romano-British prostitute who had somehow ended up buried in the cave alongside the bones of animals long extinct. He was wrong on both counts. We now know that the Red Lady of Pavland, despite the name that has stuck, was a young man, a tall young man, perhaps in his mid-20s, who died somewhere between 33 and 34,000 years ago. 33,000 years ago. This is not ancient by the standards of human evolution, but by any other measure, it is a staggering span of time. The Red Lady of Pavland is the oldest ceremonial burial yet found in Western Europe. He lived during the Gravettian period, one of the cultural phases of the Upper Paleolithic, when anatomically modern humans were spreading across Europe and making some of the earliest examples of what we would recognize as art and ritual. He was buried with ceremony. The red ochre that stained his bones was not accidental. It was deliberate, applied to his body either before or after death as part of airy ritual. The shell beads and ivory rods were placed with him intentionally. He was in death given the kind of treatment that speaks of a community that believed in the continuing importance of the individual after death, that wanted to send him into whatever lay beyond life with dignity and provision. And he was buried in Wales on the Ga Peninsula at the edge of the Atlantic world in a cave above the sea 33,000 years ago, when the rest of the British Isles was largely uninhabitable. Due to the advancing ice, when the Welsh coast was a relatively mild refuge at the very edge of what was habitable, someone brought this young man to this cave and buried him with care and ceremony. And red ochre. And for 33,000 years, the limestone of the cave kept his bones, kept the memory of that ceremony, kept the evidence of that ancient community's love for their dead, until a geologist stumbled into the cave and found him. The Red Lady of Pavland is not an ancestor of the modern Welsh in any direct genetic sense that we can demonstrate. The population that buried him was almost certainly displaced or heavily diluted by subsequent migrations. But he is a representative of the kind of community that was living at the Atlantic fringe of Europe during the Ice Age. A community whose deep-time successes would eventually become the WHG populations that left their genetic mark in modern Welsh DNA. He is the oldest known human face of the Atlantic fringe tradition, and he was found in Wales. This matters. It matters because it establishes that Wales is not simply a place where interesting things happen to pass through. It is a place where ancient things took root, where the very first human communities in the history of Western Europe chose to bury their dead with ceremony, where the ritual traditions that would eventually connect the Gravettian peoples of the Ice Age to the megalithic builders of the Neolithic, to the Celtic-speaking communities of the Iron Age, to the Welsh-speaking communities of today, where all of that began, not somewhere else, here. Now, we need to talk about Arthur. Not the Arthur of Camelot and Excalibur and the Round Table, the romanticized medieval fantasy that the English and French literary traditions constructed in the 12th and 13th centuries. The other Arthur, the one who appears in the earliest Welsh sources, in the poem Iggordan, in the battle poems attributed to Taliesin, in the fragments of a tradition so ancient that even the Welsh who preserved it were not entirely sure what they had. The question of whether a historical Arthur existed has consumed an enormous amount of academic energy and produced very little consensus. The few historians who think there was a real person behind the legend tend to place him in the late 5th or early 6th century, in the period after the Romans left Britain and before the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms consolidated their control over what would become England, a war leader of some kind, a man who organized the remaining Romano-British populations against the Anglo-Saxon incursion, a figure who won enough battles to be remembered and who was remembered in a cultural context, the Welsh and Breton literary tradition that elevated him over the centuries into something far greater than any single battle leader could have been. But what is genuinely interesting about Arthur from the perspective of the deeper Welsh story we have been telling is not whether he was real, but where he comes from. Because the Arthur of the earliest Welsh sources is not a medieval knight, he is something older. He is in the earlier stratum of the tradition, a figure who moves between the human world and the other world, who leads raids on the land of the dead, who is associated with magic and with wild creatures, and with a kind of power that is explicitly pre-Christian in its character. The poem called Prau Andrean, The Spoils of Andobian, attributed to Taliesin, but almost certainly older than any single poet, describes Arthur leading a raid on the Welsh otherworld to steal a magic cauldron. The language is archaic. The imagery is pre-Christian. The cosmological geography is the same NWN geography we encountered earlier. This Arthur, the Arthur who raids the otherworld, is connected to a much broader tradition of tales about heroes who cross into the land of the dead and return with power or wisdom or magical objects. This tradition appears in Irish mythology. It appears in continental Celtic mythology. It appears in fragmentary forms in other ancient European traditions. It is one of the most ancient and widespread of all mythological patterns in the Indo-European world, and it appears in its richest and most elaborate surviving form in Wales. Why in Wales? Because Wales preserved. Because the Welsh literary tradition, sustained by the highly trained professional poets called the Beard, the bards whose role was explicitly to be the memory keepers of their people. Because that tradition survived through the Roman period, and through the early medieval period, and through the Norman conquest, and through centuries of English political domination. It preserved material that was lost or suppressed or transformed beyond recognition everywhere else. The Welsh bees kept it, passed it from generation to generation in oral form, and then at the crucial moment in the 12th and 13th centuries wrote it down. And in writing it down, They preserved for us the deepest stratum of the mythological tradition of the Atlantic fringe, older than any of the other surviving records of ancient European belief. This is one of the most remarkable things about Wales, and it is almost entirely unknown outside of specialist academic circles. Wales is the single best preserved source of ancient Celtic and pre-Celtic mythological tradition in the world. Better than Ireland, which has a rich tradition of its own, but which was more thoroughly Christianized in certain periods. Better than Brittany, which lost much of its earlier tradition to French cultural dominance. Better than Scotland, which was subject to different pressures. Wales, because of its particular combination of geographical isolation and cultural stubbornness, and the professional big tradition, preserved what everywhere else was lost. And what it preserved is genuinely strange and genuinely ancient. The story of Predi, who appears in the Mabinogion, has been analyzed by comparative mythologists who have identified innate structural parallels with myths from India, from Iran, from Greece, from ancient sources that predate the Celts entirely. The story of Lologyaes, with his impossible births and his death and resurrection, has parallels with solar myths from across the Indo-European world. The four branches of the Mabinogi, the core of the Welsh mythological tradition, have been described by scholars as the most archaic surviving expression of Celtic mythology, carrying within them memories of a cosmological and theological system that is far older than the medieval texts in which it was eventually written down. None of this would be surprising if we knew that Wales had been a major centre of Celtic cultural and mythological production from the earliest period. But given the way that Wales is usually positioned in histories of the British Isles, as a peripheral and marginalized region, as the land that survived by retreating to the mountains, as the place where things ended up after they had already happened, somewhere more important, the richness of the Welsh mythological tradition is genuinely unexpected. It forces a reconsideration. It suggests that whatever Wales was in political terms during the medieval and modern periods, in cultural and mythological terms, it was something quite different. It was a centre, a repository, a place where the deepest memories of an ancient world were kept alive with extraordinary care. We should speak now about the dolmens. There is a word, cromlech, that is used in Welsh for the megalithic portal tombs, the structures with great capstones, balanced on upright stones that appear across Wales and across the Atlantic fringe of Europe. Pentre Efan is perhaps the most famous in Wales, but there are dozens of others scattered across the landscape in positions that seem, when you look at them carefully, to be anything but random. They tend to be placed at the junctions of natural pathways, at places where valleys meet or where ridges give wide views, at locations that would have been significant in the movement of both animals and people through the landscape. The builders of these structures understood their landscape with an intimacy that is almost impossible for modern people to imagine. They knew where the deer would pass in autumn, where the wild cattle would drink in summer, where the floodplain would be inundated in winter, and where it would be productive in spring. They knew the way the light fell at different times of year, and what that meant for the practical tasks of hunting and gathering and proto-warming sustained them. And they placed their monuments at the nodes of this knowledge, the places where the living world and the dead world intersected, where the ancestors could be consulted in the presence of the knowledge they had accumulated and passed on. This is sophisticated. This is not the practice of primitive people. This is the practice of people who had been thinking about the relationship between the living and the dead, and the landscape, for thousands of years, who had developed over those thousands of years a system of knowledge and belief that was integrated, that connected the practical and the spiritual in ways that we have almost completely forgotten how to do. When a Neolithic farmer in Wales placed a tomb at the junction of two valleys, they were not just building a burial place. They were placing an antenna, a point of contact between the human world and the ancestor world, at a location that they knew from accumulated generations of experience was significant in the life of the land. We know something about the people who built these structures. Their DNA has been recovered from some of the tombs. carefully extracted from the ancient bones that have been preserved in the acid-free conditions of certain Welsh limestone chambers. And what the DNA shows is consistent with what we have been saying throughout this account. The Neolithic tomb builders of Wales were members of the Atlantic fringe population, carriers of WHG ancestry, related to the people who built the megaliths of Ireland and Brittany and Iberia. They were not identical to any modern population, but they were most similar in genetic terms to the modern Welsh, not to any continental European population, not to the English, to the Welsh. This is the genetic continuity that runs like a thread of red ochre through stone. From the Neolithic tomb builders to the modern inhabitants of the Preseli Hills and the Gower Peninsula and the valleys of Gwynd, it is not an unbroken line. It has been diluted and complicated by every wave of migration that has washed over Wales in the intervening millennia. But it is there. The people burying their dead in the crumblocks of Neolithic Wales were the ancestors in a real and measurable genetic sense of the people living in those same landscapes today. And that degree of genetic continuity over more than 5,000 years is extraordinary. It is to the best of our current knowledge greater than the degree of continuity that can be demonstrated for almost any other population in Europe. This is what it means to say that the Welsh look different, not that they are a separate species, or a pure race, or any of the other nonsense that has been attached to this observation in various forms over the centuries, but that they carry in their physical appearance and in their DNA a larger portion of a specific ancient lineage than their neighbours carry. The face of Wales is the face of the Atlantic fringe world, the face of the hunter-gatherers who came up from Iberia after the ice, the face of the Doggerland refugees who moved west when their world drowned, the face of the megalith builders who connected the entire Atlantic coast of Europe in a network of shared belief and shared blood. All of those faces layered and blended and persisting, showing through in the particular shade of an eye and the particular set of a jaw and the particular quality of a complexion that you notice if you are paying attention. When you stand in a village in Pembrokeshire or a street in Aberystwyth, let us go somewhere even more unexpected. Now, let us go to North America, but not to the haplogroup X connection we explored earlier. Let us go to a specific and deeply contested claim about transatlantic contact in the prehistoric period. Let us talk about the Madoc legend. In Welsh tradition and in a more elaborated form in late medieval and early modern British literature, there is a story about a Welsh prince named Madoc ab Owain Gwynedd, who in the year 1170 sailed west across the Atlantic and reached a new land. He returned to Wales, the story goes, gathered a group of settlers, and sailed again, never to return. And somewhere in the interior of North America, there was said to be a tribe of people who spoke Welsh, who had white skin and spoke a language recognizably related to Welsh, and who were the descendants of Madoc and his settlers. The Madoc legend was widely credited in Britain in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. It was used to justify British claims to territories in the New World on the grounds that if a Welshman had got there first, then Britain could legitimately claim prior discovery over Spain. It was seriously investigated by explorers and adventurers who questioned various Native American tribes about linguistic similarities to Welsh, and it was eventually thoroughly debunked by historians who pointed out that the legend appears in no Welsh source before the late 15th century, that there is no pre-Columbian evidence of Welsh contact with North America, and that the various reports of Welsh-speaking Native Americans were either fabrications, misunderstandings, or wishful thinking. And yet the Madoc legend refuses to die completely, not because the specific claim about a medieval Welsh prince sailing to America in 1170 is credible, because it is almost certainly not, but because the legend attaches itself in the imagination to something that feels like a real connection, a real resonance between the Welsh cultural world and the American world, a sense that there is something to be found if you dig deep enough. What you find when you dig deep enough is not a medieval Welsh prince. It is the deep time connection we have already explored, the shared ancient ancestry in haplogroup X. the convergent histories of peoples at the edge of the world who developed similar relationships with their landscapes and their dead. The parallel stories of small communities holding on against the forces of displacement and assimilation. The Madoc legend is a myth in the technical sense, not a falsehood, but a story that expresses a truth that cannot be expressed any other way. And the truth it is trying to express is the truth of the deep time connection between the Atlantic fringe of Europe and the ancient peoples of North America. A connection that is real, but that operates at a temporal scale, so vast that a medieval legend is almost comically inadequate as a vehicle for it. The people who were telling the Madoc story in the 16th century did not know about Haplogroup X. They did not know about Western hunter-gatherers, or Doggerland, or the Atlantic megalithic network. But they sensed something, some half-intuited connection between their world and the world across the ocean, some memory too faint and too distant to be articulated clearly of the deep time relationships that the genetic record would eventually reveal, and they wrapped that memory in a story they could tell, a story about a prince and a voyage, and a tribe of blue-eyed Welsh speakers in the interior of a continent. It is not the truth, but it is reaching for a truth that is much stranger and much more profound than any legend could fully contain. Let us step back and consider the full picture that has emerged. A people at the western edge of Europe, carrying genetic ancestry that goes back further than almost any other European population. A landscape studded with monuments built by their deepest ancestors, monuments that connected Wales to an Atlantic-wide network of culture and belief that is older than any civilization we usually recognize as such. A language that is one of the oldest continuously spoken languages in Europe, preserving within its structure and its vocabulary echoes of a linguistic history that may predate the Celtic expansion of the Iron Age. A mythology that is simultaneously the richest surviving record of ancient Celtic belief and a window into something even older, the cosmological traditions of the Atlantic fringe peoples who built the megaliths and buried their dead with red ochre and believed in a world beneath the world where the ancestors waited. A distinct physical appearance that reflects the persistence of a genetic lineage that was old when the pyramids were being built. A deep time connection to the early peoples of North America that operates not through historical contact, but through the shared ancestry of people who spread across the world from the same ancient source. A tradition of cultural persistence so strong that it survived Roman occupation, Anglo-Saxon cultural dominance, Norman conquest, medieval Anglicization, the suppression of the Welsh language in schools, and all the other forces that have worked across 2,000 years to dissolve the distinctiveness of the Welsh and absorb them into the larger flow of British identity. What does this add up to? What does the full picture tell us about why the Welsh look different from other Europeans? It tells us that they are older in the most literal and measurable sense. The Welsh population retains in its genetic makeup a larger proportion of the ancestry of the first people to colonize the Atlantic fringe of Europe after the last ice age than almost any other population in Europe. Those ancient people had a distinctive appearance, a distinctive culture, a distinctive relationship with the world, and some portion of all of those distinctions has persisted into the present in Wales, diluted, but not erased. It tells us that geography matters in ways we underestimate. The mountains and the sea that made Wales difficult to conquer also made it a refuge where ancient things could persist. The same topography that frustrated the Romans and limited the Anglo-Saxons and complicated the English crown's attempts to fully absorb Wales also protected the genetic continuity of the Welsh from the demographic replacement processes that transformed most of the rest of Europe. It tells us that language is a vehicle for genetic continuity. Maintain distinct genetic profiles. The persistence of Welsh as a spoken language across 2 millennia of political subordination was not just a cultural achievement, it was a biological one. By maintaining the language, The Welsh maintained the community cohesion that preserved their genetic distinctiveness. And it tells us something about Europe that we have not fully reckoned with. The story of European prehistory is usually told as a story of replacement. Farmers replacing hunter-gatherers, steppe pastoralists replacing farmers, Iron Age tribes displacing Bronze Age communities. Each wave sweeping away what came before and replacing it with something new. But the Welsh story, the genetic story, the cultural story, the linguistic story, all point toward the limits of the replacement narrative. Replacement is not complete. It is never complete. Something always persists. Something always holds on in the mountains and the valleys and the rainy western edge of the world and keeps alive a thread of continuity that the replacement narrative insists should not still be there. The Welsh are that persistence. They are the thread that did not break. They are the echo of a world that the textbooks say was replaced, speaking back to us through the genetic data and the language and the mythology and the monuments and the faces of the people who live between the mountains and the sea. Now let us go to something that has barely been touched in the popular literature on Welsh genetics, but that specialists have been quietly discussing for several years: the question of the dark Celts. In the older literature on the physical anthropology of the British Isles, dating from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a type that was sometimes called the dark Celt, a physical type characterized by dark hair, medium stature, a particular cranial form, and a complexion that was darker than the Northern European average, but not as dark as Southern European populations. This type was observed at higher frequencies in Wales, in Ireland, and in certain parts of the Scottish Highlands than in England or in Scandinavia, and it was often associated with the Celtic-speaking populations, as opposed to the Germanic and Scandinavian populations that dominated England and the North. The scientists of that era interpreted the dark Celtic type as the remnant of an early Neolithic or pre-Neolithic population that had been present in the British Isles before the arrival of the Nordic types associated with later Bronze Age and Germanic migrations. They were not wrong in a broad sense. They lacked the genetic tools to be precise, and they embedded their observations in a racial framework that we now rightfully reject. But the underlying observation that certain physical characteristics cluster in the Celtic-speaking populations of the Western British Isles at higher frequencies than in other European populations was based on real data. Modern genetics allows us to be much more precise about what those physical characteristics reflect: the darker hair, the particular eye color, the slightly different complexion. These are not simply the result of Celtic identity or Celtic cultural history. They are the phenotypic expression of the WHG ancestry that the Welsh and Irish and some Highland Scots carry at higher frequencies than the English or the Scandinavians. The WHG, as we have established, had a physical appearance that was distinct from the Anatolian farmer lineage that now dominates most of Europe. They were darker in hair and eye color and complexion than the Anatolian farmers, and they were more robust in certain facial features, with bone structures that have been described by physical anthropologists as somewhat distinct from the gracile features of the farming lineage majority. The dark Celtic type, in other words, is the WHG type. It is the face of the ancient Atlantic fringe, showing through the genetic phalanx, and it shows through most clearly in Wales, because Wales retained the most WHG ancestry, because the dilution that happened everywhere else happened less completely in the mountains and valleys of this particular country. There is something remarkable about this. It means that when you look at the physical distinctiveness of the Welsh, you are not seeing something that arose in the Celtic Iron Age or even in the Neolithic. You are seeing something that goes back to the end of the last ice age. You are seeing the face of Europe as it looked before farming arrived, preserved by the particular combination of geography and language and cultural stubbornness that characterizes Wales. You are seeing in a population of several million living people the faint ghost of a humanity that is 12,000 years old. That should give you pause. That should make you stand still for a moment and look at the data again, because we are not talking about an artifact in a museum or a fragment of ancient bone in a labor laboratory. We are talking about living people walking around in a small country between the mountains and the Atlantic, going about their daily lives in the 21st century and carrying in their cells the genetic signature of the people who first colonized the western edge of Europe after the ice retreated. They are the oldest people in Europe, not in the sense that they are older than other people and as individuals, but in the sense that their collective genetic heritage reaches back further than any other European population that has been systematically studied. They are Europe's deepest memory, and they carry that memory not in archives or museums or written records, but in their blood and their bones and their faces and their language and their mythology and their particular way of relating to a landscape that their ancestors have known and loved and died in for 12,000 years. Let us go to the Iron Age now, to the Celts in the conventional historical sense, the Celtic-speaking Iron Age cultures that archaeology knows best, and that the popular imagination has embraced most enthusiastically, because the Celtic story, when you understand the genetic background we have been building, looks very different from the way it is usually told. The standard narrative, as we noted earlier, places the origin of Celtic languages in the Central European Hallstatt and Latini cultures of the first millennium BCE. These cultures produced the spectacular art and metalwork that we associate with the Celts, the sinuous animal forms, the intricate knotwork, the elaborate jewelry and weaponry. They were clearly a sophisticated and dynamic cultural tradition, and they clearly spread across much of Europe in the Iron Age, influencing populations from Iberia to Anatolia. But when we look at the genetics of the British and Irish Celts, the people who actually spoke the Celtic languages that survive today as Welsh and Irish and Scottish Gaelic, we find that their ancestry is not primarily from the Central European Hallstatt heartland. It is predominantly from the earlier Atlantic fringe populations, the WHG-descended peoples of the Atlantic coast, the Neolithic and Bronze Age inhabitants of Western Britain and Ireland, who, as we have established, were already connected across the Atlantic in a network of shared culture and shared blood, long before the Latin Celts appeared. This leads to the Atlantic Celtic hypothesis that we mentioned earlier, and it is worth exploring in more depth here, because it has implications that go far beyond linguistics. If the Celtic languages developed on the Atlantic coast, rather than in Central Europe, then the history of Celtic culture needs to be completely rewritten. The Celtic world would not be primarily a story of Iron Age expansion from a Central European heartland. It would be a much older story. A story that begins in the Neolithic, or possibly in the Mesolithic on the Atlantic coast, among the populations that built the megaliths and sailed the sea and shared the red ochre burial tradition, and developed the WHG-derived physical appearance that we can still see in the faces of modern Welsh people. The proponents of this view, most prominently the archaeologist Barry Cliff and the linguist John Keogh, have assembled an impressive body of evidence from multiple disciplines. The genetic evidence of deep connections between Atlantic fringe populations, the archaeological evidence of shared material culture across the Atlantic coasts predating the Iron Age, the linguistic evidence of very deep similarities between the Celtic languages of the British Isles and Breton that suggest an ancient Atlantic transmission route rather than a late Iron Age one, and the evidence from place names, which often preserve the linguistic stratigraphy of a region more faithfully than any other cultural record, suggesting that Proto-Celtic, or something very close to it, was spoken on the Atlantic fringe of Europe much earlier than the standard model predicts. This is still a contested hypothesis. The mainstream of Celtic studies has been resistant to it, partly for legitimate scientific reasons, and partly, it must be said, because it requires dismantling a century of established thinking. But the weight of evidence has been shifting toward the Atlantic hypothesis in recent years, and many researchers who would not have taken it seriously in 2010 are now treating it as a serious contender for the best explanation of Celtic linguistic origins. If the Atlantic hypothesis is correct, then Wales is not just a place where Celtic languages ended up after a long journey from Central Europe. Wales is one of the places where Celtic languages began. It is one of the heartlands of Celtic culture in the deepest sense. And the Welsh people are not the remnants of a continental Celtic culture that migrated to the edges of the world. They are among the originators of Celtic culture, people whose ancestors were speaking ancestral Celtic, or something very close to it, on the Atlantic coast of Europe, thousands of years before the Latin culture crystallized in the Alpine Fallland of Central Europe. This is a radical recentering of the Celtic story. It moves the origin point from the middle of the continent to the edge of the ocean. It makes the Welsh not the inheritors of a tradition that arrived from elsewhere, but the continuers of a tradition that began at home. And it fits in a way that is deeply satisfying when you understand all the other evidence we have been assembling. With the genetic story of WHG persistence, with the linguistic story of Celtic continuity on the Atlantic fringe, with the archaeological story of the Atlantic megalithic network, and with the mythological story of an ancient otherworld tradition that finds its richest expression in the Welsh Mabinogion. Everything connects, not neatly, not without ambiguity, not in a way that is yet settled. Consensus, but the connections are there, multiple and independent, and pointing in the same direction toward a Wales that is much older and much more central to the story of European prehistory than the standard histories have recognized. Let's talk about the language one more time. The Welsh language deserves more than the brief mentions we have given it, because it is, in a profound sense, the most durable artifact of everything we have been discussing. More durable than the megalithic monuments, most of which have lost their function and their meaning, even if their stones remain. More durable than the archaeological record, which is always fragmentary and always requiring interpretation. The Welsh language is a living system spoken by nearly 1 million people today, and within it are preserved structures and sounds and vocabulary items that are genuinely and demonstrably ancient. The word for bridge in Welsh is pont, directly inherited from the Latin pons. The word for window is a fenest, from the Latin fenestra. These Latin borrowings from the period of Roman occupation are expected, but within the Welsh vocabulary, alongside and beneath those Roman and later English borrowings, there is a core of words that have no equivalent outside of the Celtic language family. Words that appear in Welsh and Irish and Breton and Cornish with enough similarity to demonstrate common descent from a single proto-language, and that cannot be traced to any other language family known to linguistics. Some of these words are obviously ancient. The words for natural features, for rivers and hills, and the sea and the sky, tend to be among the oldest vocabulary in any language because they name the most permanent features of human experience. In Welsh, the words for these things are distinctively Celtic, unrelated to their equivalents in English or Latin or German or any of the other languages that have surrounded Welsh for 2,000 years. The word for river, Afon, is cognate with the river name Avon throughout Britain, reflecting the fact that Proto-Celtic speakers named rivers in a way that became so widespread and so deeply embedded in the landscape that even after Celtic languages retreated from most of Britain, the river names stayed. The the word means simply river, is the linguistic ghost of a Celtic-speaking Britain that extended far beyond the boundaries of modern Wales. The Welsh word for themselves, Cymru, meaning the co-anders or the compatriots, reflects a social organization based on shared territory rather than shared blood. A conception of community that is in some ways more ecological than ethnic. You are Cymru if you are of this land, if your life is shaped by these mountains and these rivers and this rain. This is a very different conception of identity from the ethnic or racial nationalisms of more recent history, and it may reflect something genuinely ancient about the way the Atlantic fringe peoples understood themselves and their relationship to their landscape. Not owners of the land, not rulers of the land, co-inhabitants with the land, part of the same system that includes the weather and the geology and the rivers and the plants and the animals. This ecological sense of identity, the sense of being shaped by and belonging to a specific landscape, rather than carrying an identity that is portable and abstract, is one of the most consistent features of Celtic cultural expression, and it reaches its deepest and most sophisticated expression in Wales. The Welsh poetic tradition running from the earliest poems attributed to Taliesin and Aneurin in the 6th century through the medieval court poets and the folk tradition, and into modern Welsh language literature is saturated with the specific qualities of the Welsh landscape, not landscape as metaphor or backdrop, landscape as the primary substance of experience. The poems name individual hills and rivers and trees. They describe the particular quality of light in specific valleys at specific times of year. They treat the land not as scenery, but as a living presence, a community of which the poet is a member. This is the artistic expression of the same deep relationship between people and landscape that the Neolithic tomb builders were expressing when they placed their monuments at the nodes of the natural geography, and that the Bronze Age inhabitants of Wales were expressing when they made offerings at springs and lakes and hilltops. It is a continuity of sensibility, a continuity of relationship that runs from the Neolithic to the present. And that is one of the most striking and least recognized features of Welsh cultural history. It is also, when you understand its depth and its antiquity, one of the most remarkable things about any European culture. Most European cultures have experienced sufficient disruption and replacement to have lost or largely lost their pre-Christian relationship with the landscape. The Roman Empire and the Christian Church together did an extraordinarily thorough job of suppressing and replacing the indigenous land-centered beliefs of Europe. In most of Europe, those beliefs are now accessible only through archaeology and comparative mythology, and the occasional survival in folk custom that has been stripped of its original meaning. In Wales, they are not dead. They are present in the language, in the place names that have been maintained continuously for 3, 4, 5,000 years and more, preserving in their syllables the Celtic words that the megalith builders used for the hills and rivers that shaped their lives. In the mythological tradition that kept Anne Dublin and Aeon and the thin places alive through 2,000 years of Christianity. In the poetic tradition that has never fully abandoned the understanding that the land is alive, that the mountains have a voice, that the rivers are not simply water, but something more ancient and more knowing than any human institution. Wales is a place where time has done something unusual, where the normal processes of replacement and disruption and cultural erosion have been not stopped, not reversed, but slowed enough that things have survived that should not have survived. That survival is not accidental. It is the result of geography and language and stubbornness, and a particular relationship between a people and a landscape that has been reinforced through enough generations that it has become, in the most literal sense, part of the genetic character of the population. Let us now talk about something that sits at the very edge of what the evidence can support, but that the evidence nevertheless suggests deserves serious attention. Let us talk about the possibility that certain things known to the ancient peoples of the Atlantic fringe, certain pieces of knowledge about the natural world and the human world, and the relationship between them, have been preserved in the Welsh cultural tradition in forms that are not fully recognizable as knowledge, because they come to us wrapped in mythology and poetry and big tradition, rather than in the form of systematic scientific or historical documentation. The megalithic builders of Wales and the broader Atlantic fringe were sophisticated astronomers. This is not a speculative claim. It is demonstrated by the careful and systematic astronomical alignments of the monuments they built. The Passage Tomb at Brynsel Dadw on Anglesey, one of the most impressive prehistoric monuments in Wales, is aligned so that on the summer solstice, the rising sun shines directly down the passage and illuminates the back of the chamber. This alignment is not accidental. It required detailed knowledge of the solar calendar, the ability to observe and record the movement of the sun over multiple years, and the technical skill to design and build a structure that embodied that knowledge in stone. And it is only one of dozens of similar astronomical alignments in Welsh prehistoric monuments. The Callanish stones in Scotland, the New Grange Passage Tomb in Ireland, Stonehenge with its blue stone connection to Wales. All of these monuments share the same fundamental characteristic. They are precision instruments for observing and recording the movement of heavenly bodies, embedded in structures that served multiple purposes, but that were at their core expressions of a sophisticated astronomical understanding. The people who built them were not primitive. They were astronomers, they were mathematicians, they were engineers, and they were working within a tradition of knowledge transmission that had been refined over many generations, passing the understanding of the sky and the seasons and the complex cycles of the sun and moon from community to community along the Atlantic sea routes, encoded in the language of megalithic architecture. Now ask a question that the academic literature rarely asks directly. Where did that knowledge go? The standard answer is that it was lost, that the Neolithic astronomical tradition of the megalith builders was disrupted by the Bronze Age transformation, by the shift in burial practices away from communal tombs and toward individual burial under round barrows, by the political and social changes that accompanied the arrival of the Beaker people and the development of Bronze Age hierarchies. And to a large extent, this is true. The tradition of building large communal astronomical monuments did decline after the early Bronze Age. The great period of megalithic construction in the Atlantic world came to an end, and many of the monuments fell into disuse. But not all of the knowledge was lost. Some of it was preserved in fragments, in echoes, in the kind of half-remembered but still functional understanding that can persist in an oral tradition for many generations, even when the original context that gave it meaning has changed beyond recognition. The Welsh Bic tradition, the professional class of poets who served at the Welsh courts from at least the early medieval period, and whose origins reach back into a pre-Christian past that cannot be precisely dated, preserved within their training and their practice a body of knowledge about the natural world that is remarkable in its scope and precision. The Welsh laws, which were codified in the 10th century under Hybel DDA, but which clearly preserved much older material, contain detailed and sophisticated knowledge about the management of land, water, animals and plant resources that reflects many generations of careful ecological observation. The triads, the traditional Welsh mnemonic devices that grouped pieces of knowledge in threes, preserve observations about nature, about animal behavior, about the seasons and the weather that have been confirmed by modern ecological science. None of this proves continuity with the Neolithic. None of this allows us to say that what the Welsh bards knew in the 6th century was directly descended from what the megalith builders knew in the 3rd millennium BCE. The gap is too large and the evidence too fragmentary to make that claim with any confidence. But it raises the possibility, which is all we can honestly say, that the tradition of careful natural observation and systematic knowledge transmission that characterized the megalithic Atlantic fringe culture was not simply extinguished, but was preserved in modified and partial forms in the professional knowledge-heaping traditions of the Atlantic fringe peoples, and that some of that preservation found its most durable home in the Welsh Bic tradition. This is a story about what survives and how, about the way that knowledge embedded in a cultural tradition that has sufficient institutional support and social prestige can persist through enormous disruptions, losing clarity and context along the way, but maintaining at its core the functional content that makes it valuable. The Welsh bees did not know they were preserving Neolithic astronomical knowledge. They were simply preserving what they had been taught, which was what their teachers had been taught, which was what their teachers had been taught in a chain of transmission that reached back through the centuries in ways that even the most learned medieval Welsh scholar could not have traced. Now, we should talk about Arthur one more time, but from a different angle. Not the mythological Arthur who raids the other world. Not the historical Arthur who may or may not have fought the Saxons. The cosmological Arthur, the Arthur who appears in certain Welsh astrological and astronomical traditions as a figure associated with the night sky, with the constellation Ursa Major, the Great Bear, which in Welsh is called Yw'r Fowler, the Great Bear, and which was associated in ancient Celtic tradition with the cycle of the year and the rotation of the stars around the pole. The name Arthur, most linguists agree, derives from the Celtic root artos, meaning bear, and in the Welsh astronomical tradition, Arthur is explicitly connected to the Great Bear constellation, to the rotation of the sky around the pole, to the cycles of time that the megalith builders embedded in their monuments. There is a genuine possibility which scholars have discussed, but which has not received the popular attention. It deserves that the Arthurian tradition in its oldest Welsh stratum is not about a historical king, or even primarily about a hero of the otherworld, but about a cosmological figure, a personification of the cycle of the year, as tracked through the movement of the stars, embedded in a mythological narrative tradition that preserved the astronomical knowledge of the Atlantic fringe peoples in the form of story. If this is correct, and it is speculative, then the Arthurian tradition is not primarily a story about heroism or kingship, or the defense of Britain against barbarians. It is a story about the time, about the great wheel of the year as the ancient astronomers of the Atlantic fringe understood it, about the relationship between human life and the cosmic cycles that the megalith builders spent centuries encoding in stone. And it has been preserved in this attenuated and mythologized form in Wales, because Wales was one of the places where the ancient Atlantic fringe tradition ran deepest and held longest. This is the kind of connection that is impossible to prove, but that feels when you have assembled all the other evidence like more than coincidence. The genetics pointing to ancient Atlantic fringe ancestry, the archaeology pointing to a sophisticated megalithic astronomical culture, the linguistics pointing to an ancient Celtic language tradition on the Atlantic coast, the mythology pointing to cosmological narratives embedded in the oldest layer of Welsh literary tradition, and over all of it the figure of Arthur, Bear King, otherworld raider, cosmological principle, holding together in a single cultural nexus the genetic and the linguistic, and the archaeological and the astronomical threads that run through the entire story of the Welsh. Let us now venture into the North Atlantic, into an area of Welsh history that is almost completely unknown to general audiences, but that has been quietly establishing itself in specialist archaeological circles as one of the most important frontier questions in the study of ancient seafaring. The question of how far the Atlantic fringe peoples sailed not just down the coast between Wales and Brittany and Iberia, but north into the open ocean, toward Iceland, toward Greenland, perhaps toward places that are even further west and even harder to credit. The Norse sagas tell us that Irish monks, whom they called Papa, were living in Iceland before the Norse arrived there in the 9th century. The sagas are not reliable historical documents in every detail, but this specific claim has been given weight by the discovery of Irish artifacts in certain Icelandic sites that predate the Norse settlement, and by the remarkable willingness of early Irish and Welsh monks to undertake what they called perenatio, voluntary exile at sea, sailing into the unknown in fragile curigs made of hide stretched over wooden frames, trusting to God and the wind and their knowledge of the sea. These were not simple or unlearned people. The monks of the Irish and Welsh monastic traditions of the 6th and 7th and 8th centuries were among the most educated people in the post-Roman world. They preserved Latin literacy when it was disappearing from most of continental Europe. They produced the Lindisfarne Gospels and the Book of Kells and the Carmenina Gadelica and dozens of other works of extraordinary beauty and learning. And they sailed north to Orkney and Shetland and the Faroes, all of which show evidence of monastic occupation before the Norse arrival. They sailed, according to the Norse sagas, to Iceland, and the question of whether any of them sailed further, following the current and the birds and the atmospheric patterns that an experienced North Atlantic sailor would know, to the coast of North America, is one that the academic community has not definitively settled. The Welsh connection to this seafaring tradition is indirect but real. The same cultural world that produced the Irish peragony, the same Atlantic fringe network of Celtic Christianity that preserved both the learning of the ancient world and the seafaring tradition of the Atlantic peoples, encompassed Wales as fully as it encompassed Ireland. The Welsh monasteries of the early medieval period, Llanwit Major and Llambeddan and Bangor and the rest were not isolated institutions. They were nodes in a network that stretched from Brittany to Ireland to Northumbria, connected by sea routes that the monks traveled as comfortably as their Neolithic and Bronze Age ancestors had traveled them for the transmission of stone and ideas and genes. And within this world, which was by no means unacquainted with the open Atlantic, there circulated stories about lands to the west, about islands in the ocean, about a blessed country beyond the edge of the known world. In Welsh, the land of the blessed, Gwyn in Gwynedd, the land of eternal youth in various forms of the tradition, was always associated with the Western Ocean, always placed somewhere beyond the horizon where the sun set. This is not simply imaginative fancy. In a culture with direct experience of Atlantic seafaring, stories about lands to the west have a different quality from what they would have in an inland culture. They have the quality of rumor, of second-hand or third-hand report of something someone's uncle, who had sailed further than usual, had once described. We cannot prove that any Welsh or Irish monk reached North America in the early medieval period. The archaeological evidence for pre-Norse European contact with North America remains very thin, though the Norse settlement at Lono Meadows in Newfoundland, which is now firmly established as a real Viking period site, demonstrates that the crossing was possible. But the cultural context that produced the Irish and Welsh monastic seafaring tradition, the same Atlantic fringe culture with its deep roots in the Neolithic seaway network and its profound comfort with the open ocean, creates a plausible background against which such a contact is not impossible. And it is worth noting that the human populations that Lono Meadows Norse explorers encountered, the people they called Skraelings, whose identity is debated, but who were probably ancestral to some combination of Beouk and Dorset Paleo-Eskimo peoples, were themselves the inheritors of a very ancient North American coastal tradition. They were in a deep time sense that neither they nor the Norse could have articulated distant cousins of the people on the other side of the ocean. Their ancient ancestors had crossed from the same Asian source population that tens of thousands of years earlier had produced the ancestors of the Europeans who were now sailing to find them. The Atlantic Ocean, which seems like an absolute barrier, was in the context of the deep time story of human migration simply a phase, a gap that had opened between populations who had once been connected and that would eventually inevitably be bridged again. This is what the North Atlantic means when you understand the full scope of the story. Not a barrier, but a pause. Not a separation, but a temporary interruption of a connection that had never been permanently broken at the level of shared ancestry. And Wales, sitting at the eastern edge of the Atlantic world, connected to the rest of Europe by genetics, and to the rest of the Atlantic world by sea routes, and by the deep time-shared ancestry of haplogroup X, was one of the places where that connection had been maintained most continuously, most consciously, most stubbornly. Let us return to Wales itself now, to the present, to what all of this means for the Welsh people who live in Wales today, and who in many cases know very little of the story we have been telling. Wales has one of the most active and sophisticated cultural revival movements in the world. The Welsh language, which came dangerously close to being eradicated in the 19th and early 20th centuries by the English education system's systematic suppression of Welsh in schools. A period including the notorious Welsh knot, a wooden token that children were forced to wear as a punishment for speaking Welsh, and then passed on to the next child they caught speaking the language, has experienced a remarkable reversal in the past several decades. Welsh language schools, Welsh language television, the establishment of Welsh as a co-official language with English in Wales, the legal requirement for public services to be available in Welsh. All of these developments have contributed to a situation in which the language is not dying, but genuinely recovering, particularly among young people. This matters for the genetic story we have been telling, because as we have noted, language maintenance and genetic distinctiveness are connected. Every generation of Welsh speakers who maintain the language and marry into Welsh-speaking communities is at the same time contributing to the preservation of the genetic profile that distinguishes the Welsh from their neighbours. The language revival is not just a cultural achievement, It is, in a very literal sense, a biological one. But the Welsh cultural revival faces a challenge that is different from any it has faced in previous centuries. In previous centuries, the threat to Welsh distinctiveness came from outside, from the English state, from the Norman conquerors, from the Anglo-Saxon settlements, from the Romans. These were external forces that could be identified and at least partially resisted. The modern challenge is different. It is globalization. The movement of people in and out of Wales in volumes that no previous period of history could match. The influence of English-language media and entertainment that permeates Welsh life, regardless of language policy. The economic pressures that push Welsh speakers to move to English cities and English institutions, and leave the Welsh heartland with a smaller and older Welsh-speaking population. These pressures are real, and their effects on the genetic profile of the Welsh population are real too. Modern genetic studies of the Welsh population show that while the ancient component is still detectable and still statistically distinct from the English population, the differences are less pronounced than they would have been a generation ago, and they are likely to be less pronounced still in the next generation. The genetic distinctiveness of the Welsh is not going to disappear in any near-term timeframe. It is too deep-seated, too thoroughly embedded in the population structure of the Welsh heartland to be erased in a few generations of increased mobility and mixing. But the trajectory, if the current trends continue, is toward gradual dilution. This is not necessarily a cause for alarm or lamentation. Human populations have always mixed. Genetic mixing is not a cultural catastrophe. The Welsh will still be Welsh, will still speak Welsh, will still maintain the cultural traditions that make them distinctive long after any particular genetic measure of distinctiveness has declined. Culture is more robust than genes. Language is more persistent than blood type. The identity will survive even if the specific genetic signature becomes harder to detect. But there is something genuinely valuable about the genetic story that is worth preserving. Not in the sense of preserving the genetic profile itself, which is not how human genetics works, but in the sense of understanding what it tells us. Because the genetic story of the Welsh is one of the most important datasets we have for understanding the prehistory of Europe and of the human species. The persistence of WHG ancestry in the Welsh population, at levels higher than almost anywhere else in Europe, is a window into a world that has otherwise largely been replaced. A window into what Europe looked like before the great demographic transformations of the Neolithic and Bronze Age. A window into the faces and the bodies and the physical constitution of the first people who colonized the Atlantic fringe of the world. Every Welsh person who volunteers for a genetic study, every sample that goes into a database, adds to our understanding of that ancient world. And every Welsh speaker who transmits the language to the next generation is simultaneously transmitting the cultural framework that has kept the genetic distinctiveness alive for 12,000 years. Let us take one final tour through some of the specific places where this story comes most vividly to life. Not as a list of tourist sites, but as a set of coordinates in a landscape that the story has been trying to make visible. Ynys Enlli Bardsey Island lies off the tip of the Llyn Peninsula in northwest Wales. 2 miles of rough tidal water between it and the mainland. In the early medieval period, it was one of the most sacred pilgrimage destinations in the Christian world. 3 pilgrimages to Badi were held to be equivalent in spiritual merit to 1 pilgrimage to Rome. The island contains the ruins of a medieval monastery, and beneath and around those ruins, evidence of human occupation going back to the Bronze Age. The island was known in Welsh tradition as the Island of 20,000 Saints, the place where the great men and women of early Welsh Christianity were buried. But beneath the Christian layer, there is something older. The island appears in Welsh mythology as one of the possible locations of the other world, as a thin place where the barrier between worlds is permeable, as a site associated with Merlin, who in certain traditions is said to sleep there, along with the rest of Arthur's companions in a glass palace, or a cave of crystal beneath the ground, waiting to be called again when Wales needs them. This is the Enoban tradition, attached to a real landscape feature, a real island at the edge of the real Atlantic. And it tells you something about how the ancient mythological geography of Wales was organized around the sea, around the islands and promenades and sea caves where the land meets the ocean, around the places where a person could stand and look west and see nothing but water and know somehow that what lay beyond the horizon was both further and closer than the horizon made it seem. Mind Preseli, which we have already visited for its blue stones, contains at its heart a landscape that has been barely changed by human intervention for several thousand years. The moorland is trackless, or nearly so. The great outcrops of dolerite rise from the heath like monuments themselves, which of course is exactly what some of them were or became when the Neolithic communities of this region selected particular stones for particular purposes. Walking through the Preseli Hills even today, even in the 21st century, you have the experience of being in a landscape that time has treated very gently. The sky is enormous, the wind is constant, the views extend in every direction, to the sea in the south and west, to Snowdonia in the north, to the English borderlands in the east, and in every direction. If the weather is right and you know where to look, you can see the traces of the people who have been here before you. Cairns and standing stones and earthworks that were already ancient when the Celts arrived, and that are in a real sense more permanent than anything. The Celts, or the Romans, or the Normans, or the English, built in Wales. There is a particular stone on the Preseli Ridge, a large outcrop of spotted dolerite called Cymani, that is believed to be one of the primary sources of the Stonehenge bluestones. Archaeologists have found evidence of prehistoric quarrying activity in and around Cymani. The scars where stones were prized from the living rock, the debitage of the quarrying process, the infrastructure of a prehistoric industrial site that was running on and off for centuries. Standing at Cymani and looking south toward the sea, you can see on a clear day the water that separates Wales from Ireland. You can see the sea lanes that connected Preseli to Brittany, to Iberia, to all the ports of the Atlantic world. You can understand in a physical and immediate way why this place was the center of an Atlantic network. It was not peripheral. It was connected. It was as connected as any place in prehistoric Europe because the sea connected it, and the stone from this place was carried to Salisbury Plain and incorporated into the most famous prehistoric monument in the world. Whatever else Stonehenge is, it is partly made of Wales, of the Welsh landscape, of the particular geology and the particular community and the particular belief system of the people who lived in and around the Preseli Hills 5,000 years ago. The monument in the middle of England carries in its blue stones the memory of the Atlantic world, the sea routes, the ancient network. It is a monument to connection as much as to any astronomical or ritual purpose. And the connection it memorializes is the connection between Wales and the rest of the world. Llyn Cerrig on Anglesey is a lake that in the Iron Age received extraordinary quantities of votive offerings. Iron Age communities across Wales and Ireland were in the habit of depositing valuable objects in water, lakes and rivers and bogs and wells as offerings to the spiritual powers that were believed to inhabit and govern the watery boundary between worlds. Llyn Cerrig is one of the richest such deposits in Britain, a cache of iron and bronze and other materials that ranges from weapons and chariot fittings to slave chains, all thrown into the water over a period of several centuries. It was discovered during the Second World War, when the Royal Air Force was building an airfield on Anglesey, and the soil-moving equipment began turning up ancient metal. The objects from Llyn Cerrig come from a geographically wide area. Some were made in Wales, some were made in Ireland, some were made in mainland Britain, and some were made in Gaul. They represent the breadth of the Atlantic network in the Iron Age, the connections between Wales and the wider Celtic world that maintained the flow of goods and people and ideas across the sea that had been active since the Neolithic. And they tell us that the Iron Age people of Anglesey, whoever they were, whatever they believed, were not isolated provincials. They were participants in a broad Atlantic Celtic world, connected to communities from Ireland to Brittany by ties of trade and kinship and shared belief. Anglesey Ynysmon in Welsh was one of the most important centers of Druidic practice in Britain. According to the Roman sources that describe it, the Romans, when they finally decided to deal with the Druids of Britain in 60 or 61 CE, sent an army under the governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus to assault Anglesey specifically because it was the center of resistance, the place where the Druidic tradition was strongest, and where refugees from Roman occupation throughout Britain had gathered. The Roman historian Tacitus, describing the battle, says that the Roman soldiers were initially stopped by the sight of the Druids on the opposite bank of the Menai, straight by their curses and their appearance, and that there were women among them running between the lines with torches, and behaving in Tacitus's Roman description like furies. The Romans won the battle. They destroyed the sacred groves of Anglesey and killed the Druids. But they could not destroy what the Druids carried in their heads: the knowledge systems of the Iron Age Atlantic fringe, the astronomical understanding, the legal traditions, the genealogical records, the mythological narratives, all the things that the Druids were trained to memorize and transmit. These survived the Battle of the Menai Strait because they were not written down, because they existed in human memory rather than on physical objects that could be destroyed. They survived in the minds of the Druids who escaped in the communities that continued to practice modified forms of the old beliefs after the Roman conquest, and eventually in the Welsh Bic tradition that succeeded the Druidic order and carried forward, in changed, but recognizable form, much of what the Druids had preserved. This is the tradition of survival that is the deepest theme of Welsh history. Not the survival of monuments, though some monuments survived. Not the survival of written texts, though some texts survived. The survival of knowledge in living memory, passed from person to person, in a chain that has never been fully broken. From the Neolithic farmer to the Bronze Age bardic singer, to the Iron Age druid, to the early medieval monk, to the medieval court poet, to the 18th century Istad contestant, to the 21st century Welsh speaker, who can trace their cultural lineage in an unbroken, if sometimes fragile thread, back to the people who carried blue stone from Preshelly to Stonehenge. This is what Wales is. This is why the Welsh look different, not just because of their genetics, though the genetics are real, not just because of their language, though the language is extraordinary, but because of what the genetics and the language together represent: the most continuous human presence in the British Isles, stretching back to the first people who colonized this edge of the world after the ice retreated, maintained through every subsequent disruption by a combination of geography and stubbornness, and the particular irreplaceable insistence that the Welsh have always shown on being Welsh. Let us think now about what the future of this research looks like, because the story we have been telling is not complete. It is not even close to complete. The ancient DNA revolution is still in its early stages. Every year, new techniques allow researchers to extract older DNA from more degraded samples, to sequence more complete genomes from ancient material, to apply more sophisticated analytical frameworks to the data that exists. What we know about the genetic history of the Welsh, what we know about the ancient populations of the Atlantic fringe, what we know about the demographic history of Britain and Ireland and Western Europe. All of it is subject to significant revision as the data improves. What we expect to find as the resolution of the picture improves is more complexity. The broad strokes of the story, the WHG persistence in Wales, the Atlantic fringe connectivity, the relatively limited steppe ancestry compared to continental European populations. These are probably robust. They are supported by multiple independent lines of evidence, and the general shape of the story is unlikely to change dramatically. But the details will change. We will learn more about the specific populations that contributed to Welsh ancestry. We will learn more about when and how the various migrations and mixings occurred. We will learn more about the relationship between the genetic history and the linguistic history, and about whether the Atlantic-Celtic hypothesis can be supported by ancient DNA from Bronze Age and Neolithic sites across the Atlantic fringe. We will almost certainly find things that nobody has predicted. The history of ancient DNA research is a history of surprises, of findings that contradicted the models that existed before the data came in. The discovery that Neanderthals and modern humans interbred. The discovery of the Denisovans, the discovery of the massive genetic transformation of Europe in the Bronze Age caused by the steppe migrations. None of these were predicted with any confidence by the models that existed before the ancient DNA evidence came in. And there is no reason to think that future discoveries about the specifically Welsh and Atlantic fringe genetic story will be any less surprising. What we can say is that the evidence already available is enough to fundamentally change how we understand Welsh prehistory, and by extension, how we understand the prehistory of Europe. The Welsh are not the remnants of a Celtic culture that arrived in Britain from Central Europe in the Iron Age. They are, in a deep genetic and cultural sense, the original British population, the people who were here first, who built the megaliths and maintained the seas, and developed the mythology, and preserved the language, and held on through wave after wave of demographic and cultural change, diluted but never erased. This is a story worth knowing, not because it makes the Welsh special in any way that diminishes anyone else, not because it supports any nationalist or ethnic claims, but because it is one of the most remarkable examples of human persistence in the entire record of our species. Because it tells us something important about how cultures survive, about the relationship between genetics and language and landscape, about the enormous timescales over which human identity can maintain continuity, and because it restores to a people who have too often been treated as a footnote in the history of Britain their proper place at the beginning of that history. The Welsh were here first, not in a legal or political sense that anyone should use to claim territory or privilege, but in the most literal archaeological and genetic sense. Their ancestors colonized the western edge of Europe after the ice retreated, and their descendants are still there, still speaking a language whose roots go back to the very dawn of human habitation on the Atlantic fringe, still living in a landscape that their ancestors knew with an intimacy that 12,000 years of continuous presence creates, still carrying in their faces and their genes the echo of that first arrival, that first settlement, that first claiming of the cliffs and the valleys and the rivers and the ancient hills as home. We should say something about the other peoples who have contributed to the Welsh over the millennia. The story of Welsh genetic identity is not only the story of WHG persistence, it is also the story of the many peoples who arrived and in various degrees became Welsh. The Anatolian farmers of the Neolithic, the Bronze Age beaker people with their new technologies, the Romans who married local women, the Irish who colonized parts of the southwest, the Normans whose descendants within a generation identified as Welsh, the English workers of the Industrial Revolution whose grandchildren became Welsh speakers. Wales has always absorbed the people who came to it. Not always peacefully, not always quickly, not always without conflict and resistance, but the pattern over the long term is one of absorption of the Welsh cultural and genetic matrix, drawing in outsiders and making them part of itself. The Welsh are a mixed people, as all peoples are mixed, and the mixing is part of their story as much as the ancient persistence. But the mixing has happened around a core, around a cultural and genetic continuity that is old enough and deep enough to absorb centuries of change without losing its essential character. That core is what the genetics are measuring when they find the elevated WHG ancestry. That core is what the linguistics are preserving when they identify the archaic features of Welsh that have no parallel in other European languages. That core is what the mythology is expressing when it describes Andan and Aun and the thin places at the edge of the world, where the living and the dead can speak to each other. It is 12,000 years old, and it is still there. Now, let us go somewhere that connects all of these threads in a single extraordinary story. To the Cambrian Mountains, the great upland plateau that runs down the spine of Wales from north to south. The watershed of the rivers, the true heartland of the country, the place that the Romans never fully controlled and the English never fully penetrated, and the Industrial Revolution largely bypassed. The place that Welsh speakers have called Wyfro Gymraeg, the Welsh heartland, for centuries. In the Cambrian Mountains, there are still communities where Welsh is the language of the kitchen and the pub, and the chapel, and the school, and the farm. Communities where the agricultural practices have continuity with methods that are centuries old. Not because the people are ignorant of modern alternatives, but because the land itself, the particular combination of soil and climate and altitude and rainfall, suits the old methods better than the new communities where the personal names that people use, the big names and the place names and the names of fields and streams and hills, reach back through the centuries in chains of linguistic continuity that the geneticist and the linguist together can trace further. In these communities, the human genetic landscape is on average more weighted toward the ancient WHG ancestry than anywhere else in the British Isles. The isolation is not extreme. The communities are connected to the rest of Wales and to the rest of the world by roads and internet and economic ties, and all the other connective tissues of modern life. But they are sufficiently continuous, sufficiently internally cohesive, that the ancient genetic signature has been maintained at detectable levels, even as it has been diluted in more cosmopolitan Welsh communities. Sitting in a pub in one of these communities, listening to Welsh being spoken around you, watching the particular faces of the people who have grown up in this landscape, is one of those experiences that makes the abstract genetic and historical argument suddenly very concrete. These are real people living real lives, making real choices about work and family and culture and language, and they carry in their DNA measurably and demonstrably the genetic memory of the first people who walked into this landscape after the ice retreated. That is not nothing. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most profound kinds of human continuity that exists anywhere on Earth. We have been on a long journey. We have gone from the end of the last ice age to the present. We have covered genetics and archaeology and linguistics and mythology and maritime history and physical anthropology and cultural theory. We have visited the Red Lady of Pavland and the Pressley Hills and the Callanish Stones and the Cambrian Mountains. We have followed threads from Wales to Iberia to Doggerland to North America and back again. And we have assembled piece by piece the argument that the Welsh look different from other Europeans because they are, in the most literal and measurable sense, the oldest Europeans. The people who retained the most of the ancient Atlantic fringe ancestry when almost everyone else replaced it or diluted it beyond recognition. But there is one more thing that needs to be said. One more dimension to this story that has not yet been fully articulated. The Welsh are not simply interesting as a genetic and cultural artifact. They are interesting as a human example, as a demonstration of something important about the capacity of communities to maintain identity in the face of pressure. The story of the Welsh is not only the story of ancient genetics and ancient languages and ancient mythology. It is the story of a community that decided again and again and again, over 2,000 years of political subordination and cultural pressure and economic disadvantage, not to stop being Welsh, not to let the language die, not to abandon the cultural forms that made them distinctive, not to accept the absorption into Englishness that geography and politics and economic logic all seemed to demand. They made that choice under conditions that would have broken most communities. The Tudor, who were themselves Welsh in origin, did more to Anglicize Wales than any foreign conqueror by incorporating Wales into the English legal and administrative system and making English the language of law and government. The Industrial Revolution brought hundreds of thousands of English workers to South Wales, creating communities in the valleys where Welsh was a minority language within a generation. The school system of the 19th century actively suppressed Welsh, punishing children for speaking it, creating the conditions for a language shift that in most comparable situations would have been final. And yet the language survived. The cultural tradition survived. The distinctive Welsh identity survived, not in perfect form, not unchanged, not without losses that are genuinely to be mourned, but it survived, and the genetics survived with it, diluted but present, still detectable, still pointing back to those 12,000 years of continuous Atlantic fringe presence. This is what HGH is about in its deepest dimension. Not the homesickness of an exile or the nostalgia of someone who has lost their childhood home. It is the feeling of a people who have spent 2,000 years fighting to remain themselves, who have succeeded against all reasonable probability, and who carry in that feeling of longing, the accumulated weight of every generation that fought and fought again and occasionally won. Here is the memory of survival, the emotional residue of 12,000 years of persistence at the edge of the world. When you understand that, when you understand the genetic and the cultural and the mythological and the linguistic dimensions of what it means to be Welsh, the word takes on a weight that no translation can fully carry. It is not a word about sadness. It is a word about depth, about a past so long and so full of human meaning that it cannot be compressed into any ordinary emotional category. It is the feeling of standing on a cliff above the Atlantic and knowing in your body, if not in your mind, that the people who stood here before you stretch back in an unbroken line to a time so distant that the concept of history barely applies to it. And knowing that you are the latest in that line, the most recent expression of something very old, carrying it forward into a future you cannot see, as your ancestors carried it forward through all the futures they could not see. That is what Wales is. That is what the Welsh are. That is the full answer to the question of why they look different from other Europeans. Not a simple genetic difference, not a simple cultural difference, a profound and ancient continuity that runs from the end of the Ice Age to the present day and that has survived against all odds, everything that history has thrown at it. The Atlantic is still there, the cliffs are still there, the mountains are still there, the language is still there, and the people are still there on the edge of Europe, looking out at the ocean as their ancestors did for 12,000 years, carrying in their faces and their genes and their words the memory of the world before history began. That memory is the Welsh inheritance. It belongs to them in a way that belongs to no other European people to the same degree. And it is one of the most extraordinary human stories on earth. Let us sit with that for a moment. Let us let the full weight of 12,000 years of continuous presence in a single landscape settle into the imagination before we go any further. We have followed the thread from the Ice Age to the present, from the first hunter-gatherers who moved into the Atlantic fringe as the glaciers retreated to the Welsh-speaking communities of the Cambrian Mountains. Today we have seen how the WHG ancestry persisted in Wales while being diluted elsewhere. We have seen how the Atlantic megalithic network connected the western coast of Europe in a network of shared culture and shared blood. We have seen how the Celtic languages in the Atlantic hypothesis may have originated on this same coast rather than in the Central European heartland. We have seen how the Welsh mythological tradition preserved the oldest layer of Atlantic fringe cosmology, the Anwan tradition, the other world beliefs, the thin places at the edge of the ocean where the living and the dead are close. We have seen how the big tradition served as the vehicle for the transmission of knowledge through millennia of political disruption and cultural pressure. And we have seen how all of this converges on the specific physical appearance of the Welsh, which reflects the persistence of the ancient WHG phenotype, the darker hair and the particular eye color and the distinctive bone structure that carry 12,000 years of Atlantic fringe ancestry in the bodies of living people. The question the title posed, why the Welsh look different from other Europeans, has a long answer and a short answer. The short answer is because they are older. Their population carries more of the ancient pre-farming European genetic ancestry than almost any other European population, and that ancestry has left visible traces in their physical appearance. The long answer is everything we have explored: the geography that made Wales a refuge, the language that maintained community cohesion through centuries of pressure, the mythology that preserved the cosmological framework of an ancient world, the sinews that connected the Atlantic fringe in a network of shared culture and shared blood, the specific events of the Neolithic and Bronze Age and Iron Age that diluted WHG ancestry everywhere else, while leaving it relatively concentrated in the mountain refuges of the Welsh heartland. Both answers are true. They are the same answer at different scales of resolution. And the deepest version of that answer, the one that requires following the evidence all the way to its endpoint, is this. The Welsh are the living memory of the first people, not the first people in absolute terms, not the first humans or even the first modern humans, but the first people of the Atlantic fringe, the first people of this specific landscape. The first people who came to the western edge of Europe after the ice and stayed, who built their monuments and sailed their sore routes, and told their stories, and made their offerings at the springs and the lakes and the caves and the hilltops, and who 12,000 years later are still there, still speaking a language that carries the echoes of all those generations, still living in a landscape that their deepest ancestors shaped and were shaped by. Still looking out at the Atlantic from cliffs above the sea, toward an ocean that their ancestors knew as a road, as a connection, as the pathway along which the culture of the Western world had traveled for thousands of years before anyone thought to call it by any name at all. The Welsh are not a mystery, but they are mysterious. They are not a legend, but they are legendary. They are not the last, but they are in the most profound sense among the first. And the thread that connects the first to the last, that runs from the end of the Ice Age to the present day, through genetics and language and mythology and geography, and the stubbornness of a small people at the edge of a large world. That thread is one of the most remarkable human stories that has ever been told. It is the story of Wales, and it's just beginning to be properly understood. We need to go back to the mountains one more time. Not the Cambrian mountains of the heartland, though we will return there. We need to go to Snowonia, to the north, to the great myth of peaks that the Welsh call her the place of eagles. Because Snowonia, more than almost any other place in Wales, embodies the paradox at the heart of the Welsh story. It is, simultaneously, one of the most geologically ancient landscapes in Europe and one of the most continuously inhabited. The rocks of Snowonia were formed in the Ordovician period, nearly 500 million years ago, in the volcanic fires of a world that bore no resemblance to anything we would recognize today. They have been worn by ice and water and wind across a span of time that makes human prehistory seem like an afternoon. And in this ancient landscape, human beings have been living continuously in one form or another for the entire period since the last ice retreated. The summit of Snowdon Tower in Welsh, the tumulus, is named for a legend. The legend says that the grave of a giant named Rita Gore is on the summit, that he was killed by Arthur, and that his body is buried there. This is mythological geography of a very specific and very Welsh kind. The tallest mountain in England and Wales, the most visible landmark in the northwest, has been given a mythological identity that connects it to the Arthurian tradition, to the otherworld tradition, to the deep, archaic cosmology of the Atlantic fringe. It is not simply a mountain, it is a named character in a story that is as old as the human presence in Wales. This is how the ancient Welsh understood their landscape, not as a neutral backdrop for human activity, but as a populated world, inhabited by beings who were older than the human communities that lived alongside them, who had their own histories and their own identities and their own roles in the larger story of the world. Every mountain had a giant or a spirit or a sleeping hero beneath it. Every lake had its guardian. Every ancient tree at a crossroads was a node of power where the spirit world pressed close to the human world. This was not superstition. It was a system of knowledge, a way of mapping the landscape that made it navigable and meaningful in ways that a purely physical map cannot match. And it persisted through the Roman period, through the Christianization of Wales, through the Norman conquest, through the long centuries of English political dominance. This mythological geography persisted in the Welsh cultural tradition. The saints of early Welsh Christianity, many of whom were associated with specific landscape features, with springs and wells and hilltops and islands, were in many cases simply the Christian reinterpretation of older spiritual presences associated with those places. The holy wells of Wales, of which there are hundreds, were not Christian innovations. They were pre-Christian sacred springs, given Christian names and Christian saints' days. The practice of visiting them, of leaving offerings, of asking for healing or guidance or intercession, was continuous with practices that predate Christianity by thousands of years. This continuity of sacred geography is one of the most striking features of Welsh cultural history, and it is connected in ways that are not always easy to articulate to the genetic continuity we have been tracing. When communities maintain a relationship with specific landscape features across many generations, they tend to maintain other forms of continuity as well. The community that knows the name of every spring and every hill and every bend in every river is a community with deep roots. It is a community that has been in conversation with its landscape for a very long time. And that depth of rootedness tends to correlate, as we have seen, with genetic continuity. The people who know the mountains are often, in the most literal genetic sense, the children of the mountains. We should spend some time on the language question from a different angle. Now, we have talked about the linguistic antiquity of Welsh, about its archaic features and its possible deep roots in the Atlantic Celtic tradition. But we have not talked about what the Welsh language actually sounds like, what it feels like in the mouth and the ear. And this matters because language is not just a system of meaning, it is a physical and acoustic experience, and the physical and acoustic character of Welsh is deeply distinctive in ways that connect it to its ancient past. Welsh has a sound system that is unlike any other language in widespread use in Western Europe. The lateral fricative, the double L of Welsh writing, produces a sound that exists in very few other languages in the world. The voiceless rhotic, the RH, is equally unusual. The mutation system, which changes the initial consonant of words depending on their grammatical relationship to surrounding words, is a feature that Welsh shares with the other Celtic languages, and that has no parallel in any of the major European language families. These are not superficial features. They are fundamental structural characteristics that reflect the particular path that the Welsh language has taken through its history. They are, in a very real sense, acoustic fossils, sounds and structures that reflect the shape of the language as it was spoken thousands of years ago. Preserved by the community's insistence on maintaining the language through generations of contact with other linguistic traditions that could have eroded them. When you hear Welsh spoken by a fluent native speaker, you are hearing something that has been shaped by 12,000 years of occupation of a specific landscape. The sounds of the language reflect the sounds of the environment. The lateral fricative could be the sound of water over flat stone, the rolled R and R, the sound of wind in the mountains. This is not a scientific claim. It is an aesthetic observation, but it points to something real. The Welsh language has evolved in and with this landscape for so long that it has taken on, in some purely acoustic sense, the character of the place. The Welsh literary tradition understood this connection between language and landscape. The earliest Welsh poetry, the poems attributed to the 6th century poets Taliesin and Aneurin, and the slightly later Llywelyn Hen tradition, is saturated with the specific sounds and images of specific Welsh landscapes. The poems name individual hills and rivers and trees with the precise and intimate knowledge of people who have spent their lives in a particular place. They are not writing about landscape in the abstract. They are writing about this hill and that river and the particular quality of light on the water in winter. They are writing with the knowledge of people whose families have been in conversation with a specific piece of earth for as long as anyone can remember, and longer. This is the literary expression of the same deep-rootedness that the genetics are measuring. The poet who names the specific river in the valley below the hill where his father fought and his grandfather hunted is the same person whose genes carry the memory of the people who named that river in a language and we can no longer fully reconstruct, who hunted in that valley before any farming was done there, who buried their dead in a crumbles on the hill above the river and had that understood the crumbles as a portal between the world of the living and the world of the dead, where their own ancestors waited that chain of connection from the anonymous Neolithic farmer to the 6th century poet to the medieval bard to the industrial-era chapel singer, to the contemporary Welsh speaker, is what the Welsh language has carried. Not just the words and the grammar and the sound system, though all of those are genuinely ancient, the relationship between people and place, the understanding that a community is not just the people who live in it right now, but the people who have lived in it through all of history and all of prehistory, who are still present in the landscape, in the names they gave to things, in the monuments they built, in the genetic inheritance they passed to their descendants. This is Wales. This is what the genetics and the language and the mythology are all saying in different registers and with different degrees of precision when they describe the Welsh as ancient, as continuous, as different from the populations that surround them. Not different in a way that makes them superior or inferior. Different in the specific sense of having maintained in concentrated form something that most of Europe dispersed or lost the memory of the first people. The genetic and cultural inheritance of the Atlantic fringe from the time before history to the present. Now let us talk about a specific and fascinating thread in the genetic story that has not received as much popular attention as it deserves. The mitochondrial DNA of Wales. Because the mitochondrial DNA, the DNA that is inherited only from mothers and that traces the female line of descent through time, tells a story that complements and in some ways amplifies the story told by the nuclear DNA. In studies of the mitochondrial DNA of Welsh populations, researchers have found a high frequency of haplogroup H, the dominant Western European maternal lineage, as expected, but they have also found elevated frequencies of certain sublineages within haplogroup H that have been associated with the ancient Atlantic fringe populations. And they have found, as noted earlier, slightly elevated frequencies of haplogroup X compared to what you would expect in most Northern European populations. These mitochondrial patterns reinforce the picture that the nuclear DNA gives us. They suggest that the female lineages of Wales, the chain of mothers that connects modern Welsh women to their ancient ancestors, are enriched for the ancient Atlantic fringe ancestry. That the women who maintained the communities, who transmitted the language and the culture and the practical knowledge and the mythological tradition from generation to generation, were themselves carriers of the most ancient layers of Welsh genetic heritage. This is not surprising when you think about it. In historical and in most prehistorical contexts, women tend to move less than men. Men go to war. Men trade long distances. Men migrate to new territories. Women more often than men stay. They tend to be the anchor of community continuity, the people who maintain the relationships with specific places and specific landscapes that keep a community rooted. And in Wales, where the landscape itself has been one of the primary defenses against external pressure, the women who stayed in the valleys and maintained the farms and taught the children and kept the language alive were in a very literal sense the biological backbone of Welsh genetic continuity. The Welsh language has a word for the women who performed this function in the Bic tradition, Ryan, which means lady or maiden, but which carries connotations of sovereignty, of the female principle as the guardian of the land. In Welsh mythology, sovereignty goddesses, women who embody the land and who must be won or pleased for a king to rule legitimately, appear repeatedly. Rhian, one of the great figures of the Mabinogion, is such a figure. Her name is almost certainly derived from the same Proto-Celtic root as the Roman goddess Epona, the horse goddess, and she appears in the Mabinogi as a figure whose connection to the land is total, who is accused unjustly and who suffers unjustly, but who is ultimately vindicated, who cannot be permanently displaced from her sovereignty no matter what is done to her. This is a mythological expression of something that the genetics are also expressing. The women of the land are ineradicable. They absorb whatever comes to them. They suffer what they must suffer, but they remain. And in remaining, they maintain the thread of continuity that connects the present to the most ancient past. Now we should go somewhere very specific and very strange, to a lake in Wales that holds in its depths, and its mythology and its landscape setting more of the threads of this long story than perhaps any other single place to Llyn Ian Fesh in the Black Mountain Range on the eastern edge of the Brecon Beacons. The lake sits in a glacial cirque, a hollow carved by the ice from the face of the old red sandstone escarpment. The cliffs above it are dramatic, reddish-brown and bare, dropping to the dark water of the lake in a way that creates an unmistakable atmosphere of threshold, of edge. On a misty day, which is most days in this part of Wales, the lake seems to emerge from and dissolve back into the cloud in a way that makes the boundary between the world and the other world feel genuinely thin. At Lenny Fanfair, there is a legend, one of the most beautiful and most specifically Welsh of all the folk tales that survive in the Welsh tradition. A young farmer walking on the shore of the lake sees a beautiful woman rising from the water. He falls in love with her and eventually persuades her to marry him. After a series of trials that involve the giving of bread and the precise quality of the bread that is offered, she agrees with one condition. If he strikes her 3 times, she will return to the lake. They marry, they have children. The farmer, despite himself, strikes her 3 times, not in anger, always inadvertently, always in ways that he did not intend as blows. And she leaves. She walks back into the lake, and she is gone. But her sons grow up to be the physicians of Midfi, the legendary healers of medieval Wales, who received from their mother the knowledge of plants and their medicinal properties. The medical tradition of the physicians of Midfi, which is documented in a real medieval Welsh manuscript, is traced in the legend to the lake woman's supernatural knowledge of the natural world. This is on the surface a simple folk tale about a fairy bride. But when you look at it, in the light of everything we have been discussing, it takes on additional dimensions. The woman of the lake, the being who comes from the watery boundary between worlds, who marries into the human community and produces children who become healers and knowledge keepers, is a mythological figure who encodes something real about the transmission of knowledge from an ancient source into a later community. The lake woman's children, the physicians of Midfi, are the human inheritors of a pre-human or prehistorical body of knowledge about the medicinal properties of plants. The story is telling us in mythological form that the knowledge of plant medicine that the Welsh possessed came from somewhere very old, from the depths of time, from a source that cannot be precisely named, but that is associated with water, with the boundary between worlds, with the other world of the ancient tradition. The pharmacological knowledge of the ancient Atlantic fringe peoples accumulated over tens of thousands of years of intimate relationship with the plants of the Welsh landscape was transmitted through generations in the community. At some point, the chain of transmission became so old that it was no longer understood as historical knowledge, but as something more mysterious, something that had come from outside the human world into the human world through a boundary crossing. The story of the Lady of the Lake and the physicians of Midfi is in this reading the mythological encoding of a real historical process. The transmission of ancient ecological knowledge through many generations until the historical origin of the knowledge was no longer remembered, but the knowledge itself remained. This is how oral traditions work. This is how ancient knowledge survives without written records. It survives by being wrapped in narrative, by being embedded in story, by being given emotional and mythological weight that makes it memorable and important to transmit accurately. The physicians of Midfi knew their plants. The manuscript that records their knowledge contains real functional botanical medicine, and the story that explained where that knowledge came from pointed back through the mythological language of lake women and other worldly origins to a source that was genuinely ancient. The knowledge came from the time before memory, from the time of the first people, from the accumulated observation of 12,000 years of living in this landscape and learning what it offered and what it withheld. Wales is full of these stories. Every spring, every lake, every hill has its legend. And each legend is a vessel carrying something from the ancient past into the present. Not perfectly, not without loss, not without distortion and embellishment, and the inevitable transformations that any story undergoes over centuries of retelling. But carrying something, some seed of old knowledge, some echo of old understanding, some gesture toward a way of being in the world that is no longer fully comprehensible, but that has not yet been fully forgotten. This is what it means to say that Wales is the oldest country in Europe, not politically, not in any event conventional historical sense, but in the sense that it has maintained more continuity with its deepest past than any other country on this island and perhaps on this continent. The genetic continuity is the measurable scientific expression of that maintenance, but the cultural continuity, the language and the mythology and the landscape knowledge and the songs and the stories, is equally real and equally old, and in some ways even more remarkable, because cultural transmission is more fragile than genetic transmission, and its survival over 12,000 years is in its way as extraordinary as the survival of the ancient genetic signature in the Welsh population. Let us go to the sea one last time, not to the Atlantic this time, though the Atlantic is always there, always present at the western horizon of the Welsh imagination. Let us go to the Bristol Channel, to the southern coast of Wales, where it faces the coast of Somerset and Devon, across a stretch of water that is narrow enough to swim and shallow enough to wade at the lowest tidal points, and that has been crossed and recrossed by human beings for as long as human beings have been in this part of the world. The Bristol Channel is not just a geographical feature, it is a highway. It is the southern entrance to the Atlantic world from the English interior, the route along which the trading networks of the Bronze Age flowed, the corridor through which the tin from Cornwall reached the ports of the Atlantic seaboard, the passage through which much later the industrial revolutions, coal and iron, moved from the Welsh valleys to the world, and it is the route along which in the Neolithic and Bronze Age the peoples of Wales and Somerset and Devon and Cornwall maintained contact with each other, sharing the Atlantic fringe cultural tradition that built Stonehenge and the other great monuments of the region. The people of Cornwall, whose Celtic language Cornish is the language most closely related to Welsh among the surviving Celtic tongues, were part of the same Atlantic world as the Welsh. Their genetic profile, while not as distinctive as the Welsh profile, shows similar patterns of relatively elevated WHG ancestry compared to inland English populations. Their mythology shares structural features with Welsh mythology. Their place names reflect the same linguistic tradition, and their history of cultural resistance to English political and cultural dominance rhymes with the Welsh story in ways that are not coincidental but reflect the shared cultural heritage of the Atlantic fringe. The Cornish are not Welshers. They are Cornish, but they are in a deep sense family. They are the closest surviving relatives of the Welsh cultural and genetic tradition in the British Isles, the other survivors of the Atlantic world that the conventional history of Britain has largely overlooked, and together the Welsh and the Cornish and the Breton, whose Breton language is descended from the Celtic-speaking refugees who crossed the Channel to Armorica in the 5th and 6th centuries after the Anglo-Saxon takeover of much of Britain, represent the last remnants of the Atlantic fringe world that was in the Bronze Age and the Neo-Neolithic, one of the most dynamic and connected cultural systems in the ancient world. These are the survivors, not the most politically powerful, not the most numerous, not the holders of empire, or the builders of great urban civilizations. The survivors at the edge, the people of the sea cliffs and the mountain valleys, who held on while the world changed around them, who maintained their languages and their cultural traditions and their genetic continuity through forces that should have erased them, and who are still here at the beginning of the 21st century, speaking ancient languages and living in ancient landscapes, and carrying in their bodies the memory of the world before history. That is the full answer. That is the complete story, or as complete as we can make it with the evidence currently available. The Welsh look different because they are different. Not qualitatively different, not superior or inferior, but quantitatively different in the specific and measurable sense of carrying more of a specific ancient ancestry than. And that difference is the result of geography and language and culture and mythology and stubbornness and a particular relationship with a specific landscape that has been maintained for 12,000 years against all the forces that worked to end it. And the story is still unfolding. New genetic research is published every year. New archaeological sites are excavated. New ancient DNA is extracted from bones that have waited in the earth for thousands of years. New linguistic analyses illuminate connections that were previously obscure. New generations of Welsh speakers are born and begin learning the ancient language that their ancestors refused to let die. The story is not over. It is ongoing. It is happening now in the genetic laboratories and the Welsh language schools and the mountain valleys and the sea cliff communities of Wales, which is to say that the oldest human story in Britain is also one of its most living and most vital. The Welsh were here first. They are still here, and the blood that ran in the veins of the people who came to the Atlantic fringe after the ice retreated, who built the megaliths and sailed the sea routes and told the stories about Annan and Aun and the thinned places at the edge of the world, that blood runs, diluted but not extinguished in the veins of the people who live in Wales today. That is not nothing, that is everything. Let us now enter a dimension of this story that is, if anything, even less well known than the genetic evidence we have been discussing. Let us talk about the astronomical tradition of ancient Wales from a slightly different angle, one that connects the megalithic monuments not just to the sun and moon, but to the stars, to specific constellations, to the particular way that the night sky looked from the cliffs of Wales at specific times of the year, and what that meant to the communities who were watching it with the same careful and systematic attention that they brought to every other aspect of the natural world. The Pleiades, the cluster of stars known in Welsh as W to Buzz, the dense cluster, or in older tradition by names that have been partially lost, were one of the most important astronomical reference points for agricultural and pastoral communities across the ancient world. The rising and setting of the Pleiades at specific times of year marked the beginning and end of the sailing season in the Mediterranean. They marked the planting season in many ancient agricultural traditions. They were used as a calendar reference point by communities from Mesopotamia to Greece to Polynesia. And in the Welsh tradition, they are associated with specific mythological figures and specific seasonal festivals in ways that suggest they played a similar kindle role in Atlantic fringe culture. The astronomical knowledge of the megalith builders was not simply a technological achievement, it was a cosmological framework. The sky was not just a practical tool for telling time, it was the dwelling place of powers and forces that governed the world. The movements of the sun and moon and stars were the movements of divine beings, or at least of beings that were more than human in their power and their permanence. Understanding those movements was not simply a matter of practical necessity. It was a form of relationship, a way of being in conversation with the forces that shaped the world. And Wales was one of the places where that conversation was most intense and most sustained. The density of megalithic monuments in Wales, the precision of their astronomical alignments, the richness of the mythological tradition that preserves echoes of an ancient astronomical cosmology, all point to a community that took the sky seriously, that watched it carefully, that built structures designed to encode astronomical knowledge in stone, so that it would survive the death of any individual observer, any generation of practitioners, any period of disruption in the transmission of knowledge. The stones of Wales are full of astronomical intention, not just Bryncelli on angles which we have already noted, but hundreds of smaller sites, standing stones and stone circles and alignments that have been surveyed by archaeoastronomers and found to have statistically significant orientations towards specific solar and lunar events. The cumulative picture that emerges from this survey is of a landscape that was in the Neolithic and Bronze Age, a kind of outdoor astronomical laboratory, a distributed observing system spread across an entire country, each site contributing its specific orientation and its specific sight lines to a community's understanding of the cycles of the sky. This is not an easy thing to maintain. It requires generations of systematic observation. It requires the transmission of observational records and anal analytical frameworks from one generation of observers to the next. It requires an institutional structure capable of supporting practitioners who spend significant time watching the sky rather than doing the daily work of farming and hearing. In other words, it requires exactly the kind of professional class of knowledge keepers that the bardic and druidic traditions of the later Celtic world provided. The Druids of the Iron Age, whom Roman sources describe as spending 20 years in training, memorizing vast quantities of material, studying the movements of the stars and the properties of plants and the history and mythology of their communities, were not a new phenomenon. They were the latest expression of a tradition of professional knowledge heaping that reached back through the Bronze Age to the Neolithic communities that built the megalithic observatories. The Druidic emphasis on oral transmission on memory rather than writing was not a technological limitation. It was a philosophical choice, a decision that knowledge embedded in human minds was more secure than knowledge inscribed on perishable materials. And it was a choice that was rooted in a tradition that had been making the same choice for thousands of years before the Druids themselves were identified as a specific cultural phenomenon. The knowledge that the Druids preserved, what we can reconstruct of it from Roman sources and from the comparative study of Celtic mythology and Welsh Bic tradition, was not primitive. It was sophisticated. The Roman sources, while invariably condescending and often hostile, nevertheless convey a sense of genuine intellectual substance in what the Druids knew and taught. Observations about the natural world, astronomical calculations, legal principles, genealogical records spanning generations, mythological narratives that encoded cosmological, ethical, and practical knowledge. All of this held in human memory, transmitted with extraordinary care, maintained against disruption and loss by the professional dedication of a trained class of knowledge keepers. When the Romans destroyed the Druidic centers of Britain, beginning with the assault on Anglesey in 60 CE, they did enormous damage to this tradition. The institutional infrastructure was shattered, the sanctuary places were destroyed, many practitioners were killed. The process of training new practitioners was disrupted for years or decades. And yet the knowledge was not fully lost, because it existed in many minds, not just in the minds of the senior Druids who were killed on the shores of the Menai Strait. It existed in the communities that had been educated by the Druids in the folk traditions that preserved fragments of the larger system, and it survived long enough to be incorporated into the new institutional framework of Welsh Christianity, which was staffed to a significant degree by people who were simultaneously monks in the Christian sense and heirs of the bardic Druidic tradition in the Celtic sense. The great Welsh saints Deusant St. David and the many others who established the early Welsh monasteries and defined the character of Celtic Christianity in Wales came from communities that were still thoroughly Celtic in their cultural orientation. Their Christianity was not the Roman Christianity of the continental church. It was a Celtic Christianity shaped by the cultural world of the Atlantic fringe, accommodating the ancient tradition wherever it could, transforming it where it must, but maintaining far more of it than the Roman Church would have preferred. This is why the Welsh saints are so peculiar, so specific, so connected to particular places and particular landscape features. St. David is connected to his well and his monastery. St. Brian is connected to his vision on the summit of Caerchen, Engi in the Precelli Hills. St. Bruno is connected to the healing spring and the holy island. These are not the universal saints of the Roman tradition, intercessors in a purely spiritual realm. They are guardian spirits of specific places, inheritors of the pre-Christian tradition of landscape spirituality, given Christian names and Christian feast days, but maintaining their essential character as mediators between the human world and the powers of the natural world. This accommodation of the ancient tradition within the Christian framework is one of the most distinctive features of Welsh religious culture, and it is connected once again to the deeper continuity we have been tracing. The same communities that maintained the ancient genetic heritage of the Atlantic fringe also maintained the ancient spiritual relationship with the landscape, wrapping it in successive layers of cultural interpretation from pre-Christian animism to Celtic Christianity to medieval Catholic practice to Protestant nonconformism, but never fully abandoning the core understanding that the land is alive, that specific places have specific powers, that the relationship between a community and its landscape is sacred in a way that no abstract theology can fully express. There is one more story to tell, and it is the most personal of all the stories in this long account. It is the story of what it feels like from the inside to be Welsh. This is not a genetic story. It is not an archaeological story. It is a phenomenological story. A story about how a particular inheritance of language and culture and landscape relationship feels to the people who carry it. And it is a story that I can only approach from the outside because it belongs to the Welsh themselves and to no one else. But I can report what the Welsh have said about it in the tradition that runs from the earliest Bic poetry to the most recent Welsh language novels and films and songs. What they say in various ways and in various registers is that being Welsh involves a particular kind of relationship with time, a sense that the past is not behind you, but alongside you, that the people who lived in this landscape before you are not gone but present in the names of things and the shapes of things and the specific qualities of light and weather that have not changed since their time, that the language you speak carries within it, if you listen carefully enough, the voices of all the people who spoke it before you, and that by speaking it, you are participating in a conversation that has been going on for as long as the mountains have been here. Understood fully, not nostalgia, which is the longing for a personal past, not homesickness, which is the longing for a particular place. Something more ancient and more impersonal than either of those. The longing for a continuity that your body knows your mind has partly forgotten. The reaching of the genetic memory toward the deep past that it carries in its cells. The ache of being the latest link in a chain that stretches back to a time when the world was different and humans were fewer and the land was wilder and the relationship between people and place was more intimate and more necessary than it has been since. The Welsh have a word for this because they have had more reason than most peoples to feel it, because they have been in conversation with a single landscape for longer than most peoples, because their language connects them to their ancestors in a more direct and more continuous way than the languages of most peoples connect them to theirs, because the mountains and rivers and springs that they have named and written about and sung about for 12,000 years are still there, still bearing the names that their ancestors gave them, still doing what they have always done, indifferent to history, but not indifferent to the people who have lived alongside them and loved them and depended on them and written about them in language that the mountains themselves do not understand, but that the mountains in some sense have made possible. This is the full story of why the Welsh look different. Not just the genetics, not just the language, the whole complex of relationships between a people and a place that has been built up over so many generations that it has become part of the biology of the people themselves, expressed in the faces that carry the ancient WH phenotype and in the language that carries the ancient Celtic sounds and in the mythology that carries the ancient cosmological framework and in the particular quality of presence and persistence and deep time continuity that makes the Welsh what they are. They are old. They are the oldest face of Europe and they are still here. Go to Wales, stand on a cliff above the Atlantic at dusk, watch the light go out of the sky in that particular way. It goes in the west, from gold to orange to deep red, to a darkness that is not quite darkness, because the sea reflects whatever light remains. Listen to the wind. Listen to the birds settling for the night. If there is a Welsh speaker near you, listen to the language, to the way the sounds that are unlike any other European sounds move through the air, and understand that you are standing in a place where human beings have been doing exactly what you are doing for 12,000 years, looking at the same sea, hearing the same wind, speaking to each other in a language that has been changing but has never been replaced. That is Wales. That is the Welsh. That is the oldest story in Britain and one of the oldest continuously lived human stories anywhere on Earth. And it is still unfolding in the labs where geneticists are extracting ancient DNA from prehistoric bones. And in the schools where children are learning Welsh. And in the valleys where the mountains rise above the clouds and the rivers run toward the sea. And in the faces of the people who have been here in one form or another since the ice retreated, and the first brave wanderers made their way to the edge of the world, and found that the edge was worth staying for. They stayed, and they are staying still. There is one more dimension that deserves to be named before this long account reaches its end. The Welsh language itself, not just its antiquity, which we have already explored, but its survival, its refusal in the face of enormous pressure across several centuries to become English. In the 19th century, the British state made a systematic effort to suppress Welsh in schools, punishing children who spoke it and stigmatizing it as the language of poverty and backwardness. By the mid-10th century, the percentage of Welsh speakers had fallen dramatically, and linguists treating it as a candidate for extinction within a generation or two. What happened instead was extraordinary. A political and cultural revival driven by people willing to go to prison for the language produced Welsh language legislation, Welsh language television, and a system of Welsh medium schools that by the early 21st century were oversubscribed in even the most anglicised cities of South Wales. Welsh is now, unlike almost every other minority language in Europe, a language whose speakers are increasing rather than declining. Children in Cardiff, whose families have no Welsh ancestors, are choosing to learn the language because they understand it opens a door into something ancient and profound and irreplaceable. The stubbornness is not new. It is very, very old. It is the stubbornness of a people who have been refusing to be replaced for 12,000 years, who have been at the edge of the world, looking out at the ocean and declining the invitation to become something else. They are still declining. The language is still alive. The mountains are still there. And the Welsh, with their ancient faces and their ancient language and their ancient relationship with an ancient landscape, are one of the most remarkable examples of human persistence that the world has ever produced. That is the answer. The Welsh look different because they are older, because they held on, because the mountains kept them, and the language kept them, and the mythology kept them. And the stubbornness that runs through this entire history, from the Neolithic tomb builders to the Language Act campaigners, is the same stubbornness expressed across 12,000 years of a community that knows what it is and refuses to be told it is something else. They are the Cymry, the Coanders, the people of this land, this ancient and beautiful and stubborn land that sits at the western edge of Europe, with its back to the mountains and its face to the Atlantic, where the oldest human story in Britain has been unfolding since the ice retreated and the world was new. And the first wanderers came to the edge of everything and looked out at the sea and decided that this place, this edge, was home. And so it has been for 12,000 years. And in the quiet of wherever you are now, listening to this in the dark, you are connected to that same ancient thread, the same human impulse to ask where we come from and who we really are. Rest now. The mountains are still standing. The language is still spoken. The oldest story in Britain is still being told. And somewhere on a cliff in West Wales, the wind is still coming off the Atlantic, carrying something ancient in it that has no name in any modern language. And the sea below is that deep greenish black, and the people who live there are still there, still themselves after all this time. Good night. If this journey through the oldest human story in Britain has kept your mind gently wandering as you drift toward sleep, you can tap like on this video as a quiet signal that you would want more stories like this one. If you want to keep exploring these deep histories of the ancient world, of the people who came before everything we call civilization, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And leave a comment if you would like, telling me where you are listening from and what time it is there. Someone in a valley in Wales, someone in a city in America, someone on the other side of the world entirely. All of us connected across time zones and continents by the same ancient question. Where did we come from? Who were the first people? What did they leave behind? For now, there is nothing you need to do. The mountains are standing. The language is being spoken. The sea is where it has always been. And the 12,000 years of the Welsh story are holding you gently in the dark. Rest well. The oldest people in Britain have been watching the same stars for 12,000 years, through every storm and every conquest and every attempt to unmake them. And they are still watching. Tonight in the dark, so are you.